In a dusty attic of a mansion, a family photo album reveals what wealth tried to hide. Within the halls of privilege, genetic proof emerges of bonds that transcend social barriers. Between faded photographs and fresh revelations lies a truth that will transform generations. As science confirms what pictures suggested, a powerful family faces its true reflection. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The Beaumont mansion hummed with a quiet, almost suffocating opulence. Sunlight, filtered through dust motes dancing in the air, barely touched the polished mahogany floors. Eleanor Beaumont, her face a mask of carefully applied composure, surveyed her domain with a practiced eye. Her son, Julian, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, paced restlessly, his ambition barely concealed beneath a veneer of polite boredom. Clara, their granddaughter, sat perched on a velvet chaise lounge, a rebellious glint in her eyes, a stark contrast to the muted elegance surrounding her. The air hung heavy with unspoken tensions, a fragile peace maintained by years of carefully constructed appearances. "Another charity gala, Mother?" Julian asked, his voice laced with a weariness that belied his outward success. Eleanor's lips tightened. "It's important, Julian. Maintaining our standing, our image." Her words were clipped, precise, each syllable carrying the weight of generations of privilege. Clara scoffed, her voice sharp. "Image? It's all a facade, isn't it? A carefully crafted lie." She glanced pointedly at the heavy oak door leading to the attic, the source of their unease. The attic, a place of forgotten things, shrouded in dust and shadow, a place where the past, stubbornly clinging to its secrets, refused to stay buried. It was there, amidst the cobwebs and decaying furniture, that they had discovered it, a leather-bound photo album, its pages filled with images that challenged everything they thought they knew. Images of a younger Eleanor, her eyes alight with a joy that seemed foreign to the woman they knew, and alongside her, a man who looked nothing like the Beaumont lineage, a man who suggested a history meticulously erased, a life deliberately hidden, a man who shattered the foundation of their meticulously constructed reality. The silence in the drawing room hung thick and heavy, laced with the unspoken fear of what the album's revelations might bring. The scent of dust motes, stale air, and decaying velvet clung to Clara's clothes long after she left the attic. She sat stiffly on the chaise lounge, the opulent fabric a jarring contrast to the rough texture of the ancient photographs she carried in her mind. Julian, ever the pragmatist, attempted to break the silence. "So, a family secret, not exactly unheard of in families like ours." His voice held a brittle calm that didn't reach his eyes, shadowed with a newly awakened unease. Eleanor, however, remained rigidly composed. "It's an anomaly, a youthful indiscretion, nothing to concern ourselves with." Her voice, though steady, lacked its usual authority, a tremor betraying her carefully constructed facade. The carefully manicured nails of her hand drummed a nervous rhythm against the armrest. The gilded surface reflected her strained expression back at her, a distorted mirror of her inner turmoil. Clara, however, felt the weight of those old photographs, the ghostly smiles of a woman who bore an uncanny resemblance to Eleanor, but whose life seemed a world away from their gilded cage. The man beside her, a laborer judging by his calloused hands and worn clothes, presented a stark contrast to the Beaumont family's history. It wasn't just a youthful indiscretion. It was a chasm, an anomaly that erased a whole branch of the family. Clara challenged, her voice low but unwavering. "A man who looks nothing like us, who lived a life we wouldn't even acknowledge. That's not an anomaly, grandmother. That's a lie." She looked pointedly at the door, the heavy oak seeming to absorb the growing tension. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, its measured beat highlighting the stark difference between their measured lives and the unknown life captured in the faded photos. The air hung heavy with unspoken questions, with the chilling realization that the carefully constructed facade of the Beaumont family might crumble under the weight of its own secrets. The unspoken fear in the room was palpable. The past, it seemed, was finally ready to speak. The grandfather clock's chime, a metallic punctuation in the suffocating silence, seemed to mock Eleanor's brittle composure. Dust motes, disturbed by Clara's sharp words, danced in the afternoon sunbeams slanting through the tall windows. The scent of old paper and forgotten things hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the faint perfume clinging to Eleanor's expensive silk dress. Her usually impeccable makeup now seemed to crack and crumble, mirroring the facade she desperately tried to maintain. Julian shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flitting between his mother and his cousin. The ambition that usually shone in his eyes was dimmed, replaced by a flicker of guilt and uncertainty. He'd always known the family held secrets, but this was different. This was a chasm that threatened to swallow them whole. Clara, however, remained resolute. The anger simmering beneath her calm exterior radiated outwards, a palpable heat that filled the room. She picked up one of the photographs, a woman with Eleanor's eyes, a gentle smile etched onto a face weathered by hard work, standing beside a man whose calloused hands told a story of toil and struggle. The contrast was stark, a visual representation of the lie they'd all lived. "This isn't just about a youthful indiscretion, grandmother," Clara said, her voice low and steady, each word a carefully placed stone in a wall of defiance. "This is about a life denied, a family erased, a man who deserved better, a woman who deserved recognition, and a child who never knew their true heritage." Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for a crystal decanter on the nearby table, her fingers brushing against the cool, smooth glass. The clinking sound, amplified in the silence, shattered the fragile piece. She took a long swallow of brandy, the amber liquid a stark contrast to the paleness of her skin. "There are reasons," she finally whispered, her voice raspy, the carefully constructed facade finally cracking. "Reasons you wouldn't understand." The weight of her unspoken words hung in the air, heavy with the burden of years of carefully guarded secrets and the pain of choices made in the shadow of societal expectations. Julian watched his mother, seeing a vulnerability he'd never witnessed before, and a flicker of empathy softened the lines of his own anxiety. The dust motes continued their silent dance, oblivious to the emotional earthquake rumbling beneath the surface of their privileged world. The past, it seemed, had finally decided to speak, and its voice was louder than they had ever imagined. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock. Sunlight, fractured by the attic's dusty windows, cast long shadows across the worn wooden floorboards. The air hung heavy with the scent of dried flowers and decaying wood, a stark contrast to the faint, lingering perfume of Eleanor's expensive silk dress. Her usually flawless composure was fractured, the carefully applied makeup now seeming to crack around the edges, mirroring the brittle facade she desperately clung to. Julian, ever the pragmatist, fidgeted, his gaze darting between his mother and Clara. The ambitious glint in his eyes, usually so bright, was muted, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, a nascent guilt gnawing at his carefully constructed ambition. He'd suspected family secrets, but this was a cataclysm threatening to shatter their carefully ordered world. Clara, however, remained an island of steely resolve. Her anger, though simmering beneath a deceptively calm exterior, radiated outwards, a palpable heat that filled the cramped space. She held aloft a faded photograph, a woman with Eleanor's eyes, a gentle smile on a face etched with the passage of time and hard work, standing beside a man whose rough hands spoke volumes of a life spent in toil. The contrast was stark, a visual representation of the chasm of lies they had all inhabited. "This isn't a youthful indiscretion, grandmother." Clara's voice was low, measured, each word a carefully placed stone in a wall of defiance. "This is about a life denied, a family erased, a man who deserved better, a woman who deserved recognition, and a child who never knew their true heritage." Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for a crystal decanter, the cool glass a momentary solace against the tremor in her grip. The clinking sound, amplified in the oppressive silence, shattered the fragile piece. She took a long, shaky swallow of brandy, the amber liquid a jarring contrast to the paleness of her skin. "There are reasons," she whispered, her voice raspy, the meticulously crafted mask finally crumbling. "Reasons you wouldn't understand." The unspoken words hung heavy in the air, laden with the burden of years of carefully guarded secrets, the pain of choices made in the suffocating grip of societal expectations. Julian watched his mother, witnessing a vulnerability he'd never known existed, a fragility that softened the harsh lines of his own anxiety. A flicker of empathy, unexpected and unwelcome, sparked within him. The dust motes continued their silent dance, oblivious to the emotional earthquake that was reshaping their privileged lives. The past, it seemed, had finally chosen to speak, and its voice was far louder, far more insistent than any of them had ever imagined. The weight of revelation settled upon them, heavy and inescapable. The attic, once a repository of forgotten things, now held the key to a future none of them could yet foresee. The brandy warmed Eleanor's throat, a fleeting comfort against the icy dread gripping her heart. The attic air, thick with the scent of dust and decay, mirrored the suffocating weight of her secret. Clara's words, sharp and precise, echoed in the silence, each syllable a hammer blow against the carefully constructed walls of her life. Julian, usually so quick with a retort, simply stared, his ambition momentarily eclipsed by a dawning understanding. "Reasons," Clara repeated, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the force of a hurricane. What reasons could possibly justify erasing a whole life? She gestured to the photograph, her finger tracing the woman's gentle smile, the lines of worry etched around her eyes. "This woman, your mother, she deserved better." Eleanor flinched. The carefully maintained facade of composure cracked further. She could almost hear the whispers of society's judgment, the stinging barbs of its condemnation. She'd sacrificed so much to maintain their position, their wealth, their social standing. Had it all been for nothing? Julian shifted, his gaze flickering between his mother and Clara. He saw the vulnerability in Eleanor's posture, the tremor in her hand, the stark contrast to her usual iron-willed demeanor. He also saw Clara's unwavering resolve, the righteous anger blazing in her eyes, a fire fueled by years of unspoken frustration. The weight of their family's legacy pressed down on him, heavier than any ambition he'd ever chased. "There's more," Martha's voice, a raspy counterpoint to the silence, cut through the tension. The housekeeper stood in the shadows, her presence as unsettling as the revelation itself. More than just a photograph, more than just a secret. Her eyes, old and knowing, held a depth of understanding that chilled Eleanor to the bone. Clara turned, her gaze meeting Martha's. The unspoken connection between them hummed in the air, a silent acknowledgement of a shared history, a shared understanding of the lies that had been woven into the fabric of their lives. The dust motes danced in the fractured sunlight, each particle a tiny symbol of the disintegration of the Beaumont family's carefully crafted image. The past was no longer a closed book. It was an open wound, bleeding into the present. And the future? That remained a terrifying unknown, a blank page waiting to be filled with the consequences of their family's long-hidden truth. The attic silence, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock echoing from the floor below, felt oppressive. Dust motes, illuminated by a single shaft of sunlight, swirled like tiny, frantic spirits. Eleanor, her face pale and drawn under the harsh light, clutched her brandy snifter, the liquid sloshing against the crystal. The scent of old paper and forgotten things clung to the air, a suffocating perfume of secrets. Clara, her defiance tempered by a dawning horror, stared at the photograph. A young woman with Eleanor's eyes, but a weariness that spoke of a life far removed from Beaumont opulence. The image, imbued with a poignant sadness, was a stark counterpoint to the family's meticulously crafted image of effortless wealth and privilege. "Mother," Julian said, his voice low, laced with a hesitant uncertainty that was utterly foreign to his usual commanding tone. This changes everything." Eleanor's gaze snapped to him, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and anger. "It changes nothing," she insisted, her voice brittle. It's a mistake. An old photograph. A fleeting moment. Her hand trembled as she raised the brandy to her lips, the movement jerky and unnatural. Martha, her presence as silent and pervasive as the dust itself, stepped further into the light. Her wrinkled face, etched with a lifetime of secrets, held a chilling stillness. She spoke, her voice a low murmur, barely audible above the clock's steady beat. The mistake, Mrs. Beaumont, was believing you could bury the truth. Some things, they have a way of resurfacing. The weight of Martha's words hung heavy in the air, a tangible presence as unsettling as the shadows that danced in the corners of the attic. Clara, sensing the shift in the power dynamic, moved closer to Martha, a silent alliance forming between them. The unspoken understanding that passed between them was a palpable force, a silent acknowledgement of the shared burden of a hidden truth. Julian watched them, his ambition momentarily forgotten, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The carefully constructed walls of his family's privileged world were crumbling, and the truth, once revealed, could never be contained. The future, once so clearly defined by his ascent, now shimmered with an uncertain, frightening glow. He looked from his mother, trapped in the web of her own making, to Clara, resolute and determined, and to Martha, the keeper of secrets, understanding suddenly that their family's legacy was far more complex, far more devastating than he could have ever imagined. The dust motes continued their frantic dance, mirroring the turmoil within each of them. The air hung thick with the scent of dust and decay. Sunlight, fractured by the attic's grime-coated window, cast long, skeletal shadows across the cracked floorboards. Eleanor, her face ashen, sank onto a rickety chair, the brandy in her hand trembling. Julian knelt beside Clara, gently taking her hand. Her knuckles were white, her grip fierce. "It's not a mistake, Mother," Julian said, his voice a low rumble, the carefully constructed facade of his usual controlled demeanor crumbling. The words hung between them, heavy and accusatory. Eleanor's eyes, usually sparkling with icy determination, were clouded with fear. "It's a lie," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the relentless tick-tock of the grandfather clock. "A fabrication." She looked from Julian's concerned face to Clara's steely gaze, a desperate plea for support in her eyes. Clara met her grandmother's gaze unflinchingly. "Look at it, grandmother," she said, her voice tight with unshed tears. "The resemblance is undeniable. The eyes, the way her mouth curves." She gestured to the faded photograph, a young woman with a haunting beauty, a weariness etching lines around her eyes that spoke volumes of a life lived far beyond the gilded cage of Beaumont wealth. Martha, a silent observer until now, stepped forward. The dust motes danced in the beam of sunlight illuminating her face, highlighting the deep lines etched by time and secrets. "The resemblance isn't just in the photograph, Mrs. Beaumont," she said, her voice a low, resonant hum that filled the dusty space. "It's in the DNA. It's in your blood." The weight of her words settled upon them, a suffocating blanket of truth. Julian looked from his mother's distraught face to the unwavering gaze of his sister, and then to Martha, whose words held a chilling certainty. The carefully constructed walls of his privileged world were indeed crumbling, revealing a foundation built on lies and carefully concealed truths. The future, once a carefully mapped ascent to power, now lay obscured in a swirling cloud of uncertainty. The silence that followed was broken only by the persistent ticking of the clock, each second a hammer blow against their carefully built reality. The truth, once revealed, could never again be contained. The grandfather clock's relentless tick-tock seemed to amplify the silence, a stark counterpoint to the racing thoughts in each of their minds. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight, illuminating the photograph like a spotlight on a hidden stage. Eleanor's face, usually a mask of composure, was etched with a raw, visceral fear. Her hand, still clutching the brandy snifter, trembled so violently that the amber liquid slopped over the rim. Clara, despite the tremor in her own hands, maintained a steely gaze. The photo, a sepia-toned relic of a forgotten time, showed a young woman with eyes strikingly similar to Eleanor's, but with a softer, gentler expression, a hint of sadness lingering in their depths. The resemblance was uncanny, undeniable. "It's not just a resemblance, Mother," Julian said, his voice low and strained, betraying the conflict raging within him. Ambition warred with a dawning awareness of a truth deliberately concealed for generations. He saw the crumbling of not only his family's carefully constructed image, but also his own carefully planned future. Martha, her weathered face etched with a lifetime of unspoken secrets, stepped closer. Her eyes, dark and knowing, held a profound sadness. The scent of lavender, faint yet persistent, clung to her like a second skin, a subtle counterpoint to the musty odor of the attic. "The DNA confirms it, Mrs. Beaumont," she said, her voice a calm yet unwavering assertion in the tense atmosphere. "This isn't just a picture. It's a piece of your history, a history you've kept hidden for far too long." Eleanor's breath hitched. The brandy snifter slipped from her numb fingers, shattering on the dusty floorboards with a sharp crack, a sound mirroring the fracturing of her carefully crafted world. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive, the only sound the ticking clock and Eleanor's ragged breathing. The weight of unspoken words hung between them, a suffocating blanket of truth, a truth that threatened to unravel generations of carefully maintained lies. The dusty attic, once a repository of forgotten things, now held the key to a future none of them could have foreseen. The fragile piece of their privileged world lay in ruins, shattered by the undeniable evidence of a hidden past. The album lay open, displaying a series of photographs, faded, sepia-toned images that whispered secrets. One showed a young woman, her face etched with a quiet sadness, her eyes mirroring Eleanor's, yet holding a vulnerability the matriarch had long buried. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams slicing through the attic gloom, highlighting the woman's delicate features. Clara traced the woman's face with a trembling finger. "She looks familiar," she breathed, her voice barely audible above the grandfather clock's steady tick. Julian, his ambition momentarily eclipsed by a profound unease, leaned closer. "Too familiar," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the photograph. The resemblance was undeniable, a ghost of a shared lineage haunting the Beaumont family's carefully constructed history. A chilling premonition settled in his gut. Eleanor, her face ashen, stared at the picture, her carefully composed facade crumbling. The brandy snifter, now empty, slipped from her nerveless grasp, shattering on the floor. The sharp crack resonated through the silent attic, a symbol of the shattering of her meticulously maintained world. The scent of old paper and dust mingled with the faint, lingering perfume of lavender, a scent Clara associated with Martha, the housekeeper, whose presence loomed large in the shadowed corners of the house. Martha, observing the family's silent confrontation, stepped forward. Her weathered face, usually impassive, was etched with a mixture of compassion and grim determination. "This isn't just about a resemblance, Mrs. Beaumont," she said, her voice low but firm, breaking the heavy silence. "It's about a truth that's been hidden for too long, a truth that has consequences for all of you." Her eyes, dark and deep, held a lifetime of secrets, a burden she seemed ready to finally release. The weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that threatened to suffocate them all. The dusty attic, once a place of forgotten memories, now held the key to a future none of them could have predicted, a future shaped by the echoes of a hidden past. The attic air, thick with the scent of dust and decaying wood, seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor, her face a mask of brittle composure, stared at the photograph, a tremor in her hand betraying her inner turmoil. The shattered brandy snifter lay like a fallen star, its fragments reflecting the fractured state of her soul. Julian, his usually sharp features softened by a dawning dread, knelt beside Clara, his hand resting gently on her arm. He saw the raw fear in her eyes, a mirror of his own growing apprehension. "Grandmother, what does it mean?" Clara's voice, barely a whisper, carried the weight of unspoken questions. The years of carefully constructed privilege, the The flawless facade of the Beaumont family seemed to crumble around them like ancient mortar. Eleanor's gaze flickered to Martha, her housekeeper, a silent observer standing in the shadows. Martha's stoic demeanor hadn't changed, but the subtle tightening of her jaw, the almost imperceptible shift in her weight, spoke volumes. Decades of unspoken truths were etched into her lined face, a silent testament to the secrets she held close. "It's a misunderstanding," Eleanor began, her voice tight with strained control, but the words lacked conviction, even to her own ears. The tremor in her voice betrayed the carefully constructed facade. Julian, however, wasn't convinced. He picked up another photograph, a slightly clearer image of the same young woman, this time with a child clinging to her side. The child's face was partially obscured, but the resemblance to Clara was startling. A wave of nausea washed over him. His carefully constructed future felt suddenly unsteady. "A misunderstanding that spans generations?" he challenged, his voice low but firm. The weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the air, a tangible presence pressing upon them all. He looked at Clara, the faintest hint of a shared understanding passing between them, a silent pact forged in the face of family secrets. Clara's eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and determination, met Julian's. "This woman, is she?" She trailed off, unable to voice the terrible implication. Martha stepped closer, her gaze sweeping over the trio, her expression unreadable. "It's time the truth saw the light of day," she stated, her voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced the room. The weight of her words settled upon them, a promise of revelation, a harbinger of change. The dusty attic, once a repository of forgotten memories, had become the crucible where the Beaumont family's carefully constructed reality would be irrevocably altered. The clock ticked on, each second a hammer blow against the crumbling walls of their carefully maintained world. The silence was broken only by the steady, relentless ticking, each second a stark reminder of time's relentless march forward, a march towards an uncertain but unavoidable future. The photograph felt brittle beneath Clara's trembling fingers. It depicted a young woman with laughing eyes, strikingly similar to Clara herself, but dressed in clothes that belonged to a different era, a simpler time, far removed from the Beaumont family's opulent lifestyle. The faded sepia tone couldn't mask the woman's radiant spirit. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight piercing the attic's gloom, illuminating the intricate detail of her worn cotton dress. Beside her, a child, a blurry figure, but undeniably a child, clung to her hand. "She's beautiful," Clara whispered, her voice catching. The raw emotion in her tone was a stark contrast to Eleanor's carefully maintained composure. Eleanor stood rigid, a statue of denial sculpted from decades of carefully constructed privilege. Julian, his gaze fixed on the photograph, felt a sickening twist in his gut. The resemblance to Clara was undeniable, a chilling echo of a past he never knew existed. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a sharp counterpoint to the dusty warmth of the attic air. He looked at his mother, a silent plea in his eyes. The carefully crafted facade of strength was cracking, revealing the fear beneath. "It's a family resemblance," Eleanor stammered, her voice betraying the tremor in her hands. She reached for the photograph, her fingers brushing against Clara's. The gesture, intended to soothe, only served to amplify the tension hanging heavy in the air. Martha, her face a roadmap of unspoken stories, watched them silently. Her silence felt heavier than any accusation. The air thrummed with unspoken questions, with years of buried secrets rising to the surface like a suffocating tide. The ticking grandfather clock in the hall seemed to amplify the silence, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile foundation of their lives. Clara, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, met Julian's gaze. In that shared glance, a silent agreement passed between them. This wasn't just a family resemblance. This was something far more profound, far more unsettling. The dusty attic, once a repository of forgotten memories, was now a crucible where their carefully constructed lives were being irrevocably reshaped. The truth, long hidden in the shadows, was beginning to emerge. Another photograph, this one slightly larger, showed the same young woman, her arm around a man in a worn work shirt. His face was obscured by shadow, but the strength in his posture was undeniable. Clara traced the woman's face, her fingertip lingering on the faint smile etched into the aged paper. The dust motes danced in the weak sunlight, casting fleeting shadows that mimicked the uncertainty swirling in her heart. "Who is he?" she whispered, the question hanging heavy in the stifling attic air. Julian, his face pale, swallowed hard. I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a breath. He felt the weight of his family's secrets pressing down on him, a physical burden almost too heavy to bear. The carefully cultivated image of his family, a fortress built on wealth and privilege, was crumbling before his eyes. Eleanor, her face a mask of controlled fury, stepped forward. "Enough," she snapped, her voice sharp and brittle. "This is all nonsense. A coincidence, a family resemblance. Nothing more." Her hand trembled as she reached for the photograph, her touch hesitant, betraying the turmoil beneath her composure. The effort to maintain control was evident in the tight set of her jaw and the almost imperceptible tremor in her voice. Martha, silent until now, cleared her throat, a sound that resonated with the weight of years of unspoken truths. "Coincidence?" she repeated, her voice low and steady, a stark contrast to Eleanor's desperate attempt at denial. "Some coincidences, Miss Eleanor, have a way of revealing themselves." Her gaze lingered on the photograph, a deep sadness clouding her eyes. It was a look that spoke of a shared secret, a hidden history that connected them all in ways they were only beginning to understand. The heavy silence that followed felt thick and suffocating. The ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs seemed amplified, each tick a hammer blow against the increasingly fragile facade of the Beaumont family's perfect past. Clara looked from her grandmother's rigid posture to Julian's troubled face, then back to the photograph. The woman's smiling face, so strikingly familiar, seemed to hold the key to a truth that would shatter their carefully constructed world. The dusty attic, once a place of forgotten things, was now a crucible forging a new reality. The weight of the unseen future loomed, heavy and uncertain. The air hung thick with dust motes dancing in the single shaft of sunlight slicing through the attic's gloom. Clara's breath hitched. The woman in the photograph, her grandmother's youthful self, wasn't just strikingly similar to her. It was unsettlingly familiar. A sense of profound unease settled in her stomach, a cold knot of dread tightening with each passing second. This is impossible," Julian breathed, his voice barely audible above the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock echoing from downstairs. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning horror. The polished facade of his life, meticulously crafted by generations of Beaumonts, was fracturing before his eyes, revealing a jagged, uncomfortable truth. Eleanor, her face a mask of icy control, remained rigidly silent, her eyes darting nervously between the photograph and Martha, who stood silently observing them, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the frantic scratching of Clara's fingertip against the aged paper. Martha finally spoke, her voice low and husky, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years of unspoken secrets. "Miss Eleanor," she began, her gaze unwavering, "denying the truth only makes the darkness grow." A single tear traced a path down her weathered cheek, a silent testament to the burden she'd carried for so long. Her voice trembled slightly as she continued. "Some secrets, no matter how carefully buried, have a way of blooming into the light." The weight of her words settled on them like a shroud. The ornate dust-covered furniture, the cobwebbed corners, the very air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Eleanor's rigid composure finally cracked, a shudder running through her body. Her carefully constructed world, built on a foundation of lies and omissions, was collapsing around her. The dusty attic, once a repository of forgotten memories, was transforming into a crucible of truth, forging a new reality for the Beaumont family. The silence hung heavy, pregnant with the unspoken, the unacknowledged. The past was no longer buried. It was rising, demanding to be seen, to be confronted. The dust motes, illuminated by the weak sunlight, swirled like tiny, frantic spirits. Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for a smaller photograph tucked within the larger one. A faded image of a young woman with eyes startlingly like Clara's, a woman who bore no resemblance to the refined Beaumonts. A wave of nausea washed over her. This wasn't just unsettling. It was a cataclysmic threat to everything she'd built. "Mother?" Julian said, his voice low, laced with a hesitant fear that mirrored her own. He'd always admired his mother's strength, her unwavering control. Seeing this fragility, this crack in her armor, was jarring. He felt the familiar pang of loyalty war with a burgeoning sense of dread. Clara, however, felt only a surge of fierce curiosity. The young woman in the photo, with her kind smile and simple dress, seemed a world away from the gilded cage Clara herself inhabited. A kinship sparked, an inexplicable connection that transcended the faded sepia tones. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, yet filled with an unexpected power. Martha watched them, her ancient eyes reflecting the attic's gloom. She'd seen this moment coming for years, the secrets she'd guarded so fiercely, poised to erupt. The silence felt oppressive, a thick blanket smothering the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't shatter the Beaumont legacy entirely. The scent of old paper and decaying wood filled the air, a poignant perfume of secrets revealed. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice brittle, the carefully constructed facade finally crumbling. "It's a mistake," she stammered, her hand flying to her throat, a desperate attempt to quell the rising panic. "A family, a misunderstanding." The lie felt thin, even to her own ears. The weight of decades of deception pressed down on her, suffocating her. The grandfather clock downstairs chimed, each toll a hammer blow against the fragile peace. Julian stepped closer to his mother, a hand resting gently on her arm, a silent offer of support. But the unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Could their bond withstand the truth? Could their family survive the exposure of a past they'd so meticulously hidden? The attic, once a symbol of forgotten history, had become a stage for the unfolding drama of their lives. The shadows deepened, the air thickened, as the first cracks in the Beaumont family's carefully constructed reality deepened into chasms. The dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight piercing the attic's gloom. Eleanor's denial felt as brittle as the ancient floorboards beneath their feet. Julian's hand, resting on her arm, offered more comfort to him than to her. His usual ambition was muted, replaced by a cautious concern. Clara, however, was on fire. "A mistake?" she repeated, her voice sharp, cutting through the suffocating silence. "Grandmother, that woman's eyes. They're mine. And yours." She pointed a trembling finger at the photograph, its sepia tones highlighting the undeniable resemblance. Eleanor flinched, her composure cracking further. The meticulously crafted facade, maintained for decades, was crumbling like ancient plaster. The scent of dust and decay, usually unnoticed, now felt heavy, suffocating. Each tick of the grandfather clock downstairs echoed the relentless march of time, exposing the years of carefully concealed truths. Martha, perched on a rickety stool, observed them with an unsettling calm. Her eyes, deep pools of shadowed wisdom, held a hint of something akin to pity. She'd seen this coming. She'd known the day the family's meticulously constructed reality would shatter. "There's more," Martha rasped, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. She gestured towards a small, leather-bound book tucked away in a dusty trunk. "This belonged to your great-grandmother." The book, bound in worn leather, seemed to hum with unspoken stories. Julian cautiously opened it, revealing delicate, spidery handwriting. The pages chronicled a life lived far from the gilded cage of the Beaumont mansion, a life of hardship, love, and a secret that had been passed down through generations, whispered from one generation to the next. A photograph slipped from the book's pages, falling onto the dusty floorboards. It showed a young man with a kind smile and eyes that reflected the same warmth as those of the woman in the faded picture. A man who was not a Beaumont. Clara picked it up, her fingers tracing the faded edges. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the frantic beating of their hearts. The weight of history, of untold stories, pressed down on them, heavier than any family heirloom. The truth, once hidden in dust and shadows, was finally coming to light. The family's legacy, their identity, their very sense of self was about to undergo a transformation they could barely begin to comprehend. The cracks in the Beaumonts' carefully constructed reality had become gaping chasms. The leather-bound book lay open, its brittle pages whispering secrets. Julian traced the spidery script, his breath catching in his throat. The words described a life lived in stark contrast to the Beaumonts' opulent existence, a life of poverty, resilience, and a love that transcended social barriers. A single tear escaped his eye, unnoticed in the dim light. Eleanor, her face a mask of strained composure, watched him. The carefully constructed dam of her denial was beginning to crumble, the pressure of the truth too great to contain. She felt a cold dread creep into her heart, a fear not of exposure, but of the profound unknown that lay ahead. Clara, however, felt a surge of anger. The injustice of it all, the blatant lie that had shaped generations, ignited a fire within her. "So this is it," she muttered, her voice raw with emotion. "This is the history they hid from us?" Martha, her gaze fixed on the photograph of the unknown man, remained silent, her expression unreadable. She had seen this coming, this unraveling of a carefully woven tapestry of lies. But even she, keeper of secrets for decades, was unprepared for the raw emotion that flooded the attic. The air hung heavy, thick with unspoken words and the weight of generations of silence. The grandfather clock downstairs chimed, each toll a hammer blow against the fragile facade of the Beaumont family. The dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight, illuminating the fear in Eleanor's eyes, the turmoil in Julian's, and the fierce determination burning in Clara's. "This changes everything," Julian whispered, his voice barely audible above the frantic beating of his own heart. He looked at his mother, his eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and reproach. The ambition that once consumed him felt insignificant, a paltry thing compared to the truth that now lay before them. The family he knew, the life he'd lived, was irrevocably altered. The future, once a clear path, was now shrouded in uncertainty. The weight of their shared legacy pressed down, heavy and inescapable. The silence in the attic hung thick and heavy, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock echoing from below. Dust motes danced in the lone sunbeam, illuminating the strained faces gathered around the ancient photo album. Eleanor, her usually impeccable composure shattered, clutched a lace handkerchief, her knuckles white. Julian, his ambition momentarily eclipsed by a wave of disorientation, stared at the faded photograph of a smiling man, his features strikingly familiar yet utterly alien. Clara, her anger simmering just beneath the surface, felt a surge of protectiveness for this unknown ancestor, a kinship born not of blood, but of shared injustice. "We need to know," Clara said, her voice low but firm, breaking the suffocating silence. "We need to know who he is." Julian nodded, his gaze still fixed on the photograph. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him, a heavy cloak stifling his usual ambition. "A DNA test," he suggested, his voice barely a whisper. "It's the only way." Eleanor, though terrified of what the results might reveal, could see the unwavering determination in her granddaughter's eyes, the same fierce spirit she herself had once possessed, before years of carefully constructed privilege had dulled its edges. A reluctant sigh escaped her lips. "Very well," she conceded, her voice brittle. "But if this changes everything, I want to be prepared." Martha, silent observer of their unfolding drama, stepped forward, her eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. "There are things you need to understand, things that go beyond this photograph," she warned, her voice raspy with age and hidden knowledge. "This is only the beginning." Her words hung in the air, pregnant with unspoken truths, a palpable sense of foreboding settling over the group. The attic, once a repository of forgotten memories, now felt like the epicenter of a seismic shift, threatening to unravel their meticulously constructed lives. The decision to proceed with the DNA test, a seemingly simple act, felt monumental, a leap into the unknown that would forever alter the course of the Beaumont family's history. The weeks that followed were a blur of anxious anticipation. The sterile environment of the testing clinic felt a stark contrast to the dusty, secrets-laden attic. Eleanor, her usual composure a fragile mask, fidgeted with a perfectly manicured hand. Julian, usually the picture of controlled ambition, paced silently, his reflection in the chrome-plated fixtures a stranger to him. Only Clara seemed at ease, a quiet strength radiating from her as she held her grandmother's hand, offering silent reassurance. The air thrummed with unspoken fears and hopes. The results arrived like a thunderclap, shattering the fragile calm. The doctor's voice, though carefully neutral, held the weight of revelation. A half-sibling, a paternal uncle, a man whose existence had been meticulously erased from their family narrative. The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by Eleanor's sharp intake of breath and the clatter of a dropped pen. Julian's carefully constructed world tilted precariously on its axis. His ambition, once his guiding star, now seemed insignificant compared to this seismic shift in his family history. Clara, however, felt a surge of something akin to exhilaration. This was confirmation of the whispers, the inconsistencies, the shadows in the carefully curated photographs. "He had a life," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "A life outside of our gilded cage." The revelation ignited something within her, a spark of rebellion fueled by a newfound empathy, a connection to a lineage she never knew existed. The dusty attic became a sanctuary, not of secrets, but of discovery. They pored over old letters, faded photographs, researching this hidden branch of their family tree. Each unearthed detail painted a portrait of a man ostracized for loving someone deemed unsuitable. The weight of their ancestors' silent story pressed upon them, a heavy reminder of their own carefully constructed illusions. The carefully manicured facade of the Beaumont family was crumbling, revealing the raw, vulnerable core beneath. Martha, silent observer now active participant, revealed fragments of the story, her words carefully chosen, laced with a profound sadness and a quiet strength. The weight of her own hidden connection to this lost branch of the family was palpable. The past was no longer a distant echo, but a relentless tide, pulling them into its unforgiving current. The scent of old paper and dust clung to them, a tangible reminder of the secrets unearthed. Eleanor, her face etched with a weariness that belied her usual composure, stared at a sepia-toned photograph, a young woman with laughing eyes clutching a child. "This is her," Martha whispered, her voice raspy with age. "His wife, Eliza." Julian ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, his ambition momentarily eclipsed by a profound unease. "And what happened to them?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Clara, however, felt a strange pull towards the woman in the picture. There was a resilience in her gaze, a quiet defiance that resonated deeply. "They were different," she murmured, tracing the faded lines of the photograph with her fingertip. "Not like us." The silence that followed was filled only with the ticking of an ancient grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a hammer blow against the carefully constructed reality of their lives. Martha cleared her throat, the sound brittle. "Eliza, she wasn't from the right sort of family. Eleanor's father, he didn't approve." She paused, her gaze distant, lost in the memories of a past she could not escape. "The scandal, it was hushed up. Money, it speaks louder than truth always has." Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for a framed portrait of her late father, his stern features a stark contrast to the gentle smile of the woman in the faded photograph. He made sure no one ever knew," she finally whispered, her voice breaking. The admission, long suppressed, hung in the air, thick with regret and the weight of years of carefully maintained deception. But he couldn't erase it entirely, Clara stated, her voice low but firm. The photos, Martha's stories. It all points to a truth he tried to bury. Julian, finally speaking, his voice laced with a newfound understanding, said, "It wasn't just erased, Clara. It was actively suppressed. Our family history is a tapestry woven with lies and omission." He looked at his mother, his expression a mixture of anger and compassion. "And we're all wearing the consequences." The weight of that realization settled upon them, heavy and undeniable. The dusty attic, once a repository of secrets, had become a crucible where their carefully constructed lives were being reshaped, the fragments of their hidden past revealing a truth far more complex and profound than they could have ever imagined. The journey toward understanding had only just begun. The air in the Beaumont mansion hung heavy with unspoken words. Dust motes danced in the lone shaft of sunlight slicing through the attic's gloom, illuminating the faces etched with a mixture of apprehension and dawning dread. Eleanor, her usually impeccable composure shattered, nervously fingered a strand of pearls, the rhythmic clicking a counterpoint to the frantic thumping of her heart. Julian, his ambition momentarily eclipsed by a profound sense of betrayal, stared at the ancient photo album, its worn leather cover a testament to years of carefully guarded secrets. Clara, however, felt a surge of fierce determination. This wasn't just about uncovering a family secret. It was about reclaiming a stolen history. "We need to know," Clara stated, her voice clear and unwavering, cutting through the suffocating silence. "We need answers." Her gaze swept across her mother's trembling hands, then to Julian's conflicted expression. The weight of their family's carefully constructed facade pressed down on them, threatening to suffocate them all. "DNA testing," Julian finally said, his voice rough, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "It's the only way to be certain." The suggestion hung in the air, fragile yet potent, a bridge between suspicion and irrefutable truth. The idea, once unthinkable, now felt like a desperate necessity, a leap into the unknown. Eleanor's breath hitched. The thought of confronting the past, of tearing down the carefully erected walls of her life, filled her with a chilling terror. Yet, the subtle shift in her children's expressions, the unwavering resolve in Clara's eyes, the grim acceptance in Julian's, hinted at an inevitable truth she could no longer deny. The silence stretched, broken only by the whisper of the wind sighing through a cracked window pane, a mournful lament for a past buried deep beneath layers of wealth and deceit. The decision, though unspoken, hung heavy in the air, thick with the scent of old paper and the promise of a future irrevocably changed. The journey into the heart of their family's hidden history had begun. The sterile white of the laboratory felt a stark contrast to the dusty attic. Eleanor clutched a tissue, her knuckles bone white. Julian paced, the polished floor echoing his restless energy. Clara, however, sat calmly, a stark stillness in her posture that belied the turmoil within. The silence, punctuated only by the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional click of a keyboard, felt thick with anticipation, a suffocating blanket woven from hope and fear. Dr. Eris entered, his expression carefully neutral, a practiced mask concealing whatever news he carried. He placed a file on the table, the crisp paper a jarring sound in the hushed room. "The results are conclusive," he began, his voice measured, each word carrying immense weight. "There is a 99.99% probability of a paternal half-sibling, a previously unknown relative on Julian's father's side." Eleanor gasped, a choked sound lost in the sudden silence that followed. Julian's jaw tightened, his face paling beneath his tan. Clara, however, remained strangely still, her eyes fixed on the file as if it held the key to a hidden world. The revelation hung in the air, a heavy shroud of disbelief and dawning horror. "Impossible," Eleanor whispered, the words barely audible, yet laced with a desperate plea for denial. The carefully constructed world she had built, the legacy she had so meticulously curated, was crumbling before her eyes, brick by brick. Her breath hitched, her chest constricting with a suffocating grief. The pearls around her neck felt heavy, a suffocating reminder of the wealth that couldn't buy her peace of mind. Julian's silence was a storm brewing, a tempest of conflicting emotions. Ambition, always a driving force in his life, now warred with a profound sense of betrayal, the violation of a carefully crafted family narrative. He felt a strange disconnect, as though the man he saw in the mirror was a stranger, his life a carefully constructed lie. He looked at the file, his eyes widening with a mix of shock and a growing, unsettling curiosity. Clara, however, showed no outward display of shock, her calm exterior hinting at a quiet strength. "Who?" she asked, her voice steady, devoid of emotion, yet filled with a steely resolve. It was a question, yes, but also a demand. A demand for truth, for history, and for justice. The weight of unspoken words pressed down on the three of them, the unspoken truths finally ready to be brought into the light. The journey to uncover their family's secret was only just beginning, and it would forever alter the dynamics of this privileged family and their future. The sterile scent of antiseptic stung Eleanor's nostrils, a stark contrast to the dusty attic's aroma of aged wood and forgotten things. Julian, his usual polished composure fractured, ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. Clara, however, remained unervingly calm, her gaze fixed on the doctor's impassive face. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic hum of laboratory equipment. Dr. Aris cleared his throat. The DNA confirms a 99.99% probability of a paternal half-sibling, he stated, his voice a flat monotone against the backdrop of their rising anxieties. The words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Eleanor gasped, a choked sound barely escaping her lips. Her carefully constructed world, built on a foundation of lies and privilege, crumbled around her. The weight of her deceit pressed down on her, a crushing burden. Tears welled in her eyes, threatening to spill over. Julian's face paled. The ambition that had always driven him warred with a profound sense of betrayal. The meticulously crafted narrative of his life felt like a cheap imitation, a carefully constructed facade. He felt lost, adrift in a sea of confusion and self-doubt. Clara, however, remained the eye of the storm. Her unwavering gaze met the doctor's, a silent challenge. "Who?" she asked, her voice low but firm, devoid of emotion, yet resonating with steely determination. It wasn't a question. It was a demand for truth, a demand for justice. The doctor, seemingly unfazed by her intensity, presented a file. The research suggests a connection to a family, significantly outside your established social circle. Further investigation is needed. His words hung in the air, the implications heavy and undeniable. The three Beaumonts sat in stunned silence. Their carefully constructed world, their privileged existence, was irrevocably shattered. The journey had only just begun. The sterile white of the doctor's office seemed to amplify the silence, a stark contrast to the hushed whispers and dusty secrets of the Beaumont attic. Eleanor's carefully applied lipstick trembled, a fragile mask against the raw terror in her eyes. Julian, usually so composed, fidgeted, the expensive fabric of his suit suddenly feeling like a suffocating shroud. Clara, however, remained a still point in the maelstrom, her gaze unwavering as she absorbed the weight of the doctor's words. The name is Elias Thorne," Dr. Aris said, his voice low, the file resting heavily on his polished desk. The name hung in the air, foreign yet somehow resonant, a discordant note in their symphony of privilege. Eleanor's breath hitched. Elias Thorne. The name conjured a ghost, a whisper from a past she'd meticulously buried. Shame, cold and suffocating, coiled around her. A laborer," she whispered, the words barely audible, a confession more than a statement. Julian's face was a mask of conflicting emotions. Betrayal warred with the ingrained loyalty he'd always felt for his mother. His carefully cultivated ambition felt suddenly hollow, a pursuit of power built on a foundation of lies. He looked at Clara, searching for solace, for understanding, but found only the unwavering intensity of her gaze. Clara, however, felt a strange sense of calm amidst the chaos. The revelation, though shocking, confirmed a suspicion that had been simmering beneath the surface of her rebellious spirit. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, revealing a history far more complex, far more interesting than the sanitized version her grandmother had always presented. She picked up the file, her fingers tracing the faded photograph of a young man with kind eyes and calloused hands, Elias Thorne. The resemblance to Julian was undeniable. The truth, long hidden, was finally coming to light. "And his descendants?" she asked, her voice steady, even as a thrill of righteous anger coursed through her veins. The fight had only just begun. The fight for justice, for a family reckoning. The fight for a truth that transcended wealth and privilege. The doctor's office felt colder than the autumn air outside. Eleanor's carefully constructed composure crumbled, replaced by a tremor in her hand as she clutched her handbag. The polished mahogany desk reflected the stark fluorescent lights, amplifying the silence that hung heavy in the air. Julian, his usually impeccable grooming slightly askew, ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying his inner turmoil. His ambition, once a burning fire, felt like ashes in his mouth. Clara, however, remained resolute. The revelation, while shocking, ignited a fire within her, a righteous anger that simmered beneath the surface of her calm exterior. She watched her grandmother's carefully crafted facade crack, revealing the fear beneath. A complex tapestry of emotions, pity, anger, and a burgeoning understanding wove itself through her. "Elias Thorne," Dr. Eris repeated, his voice a quiet counterpoint to the chaos swirling within the Beaumonts. "A laborer. His DNA matches Julian's with a 99.9% probability." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Eleanor's breath hitched, a small gasp lost in the sterile silence. The carefully curated narrative of her life, the one she had so meticulously crafted for herself and her family, lay in ruins. Shame, raw and visceral, washed over her, leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. She looked at her son, her gaze filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. Julian's face was a battlefield of emotions. Betrayal warred with loyalty, ambition wrestled with conscience. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him, heavier than any burden of expectation his mother had ever placed upon his shoulders. He met Clara's gaze, seeking some semblance of understanding, some solace in the storm raging within him. He found none, only the unwavering intensity of her focus. Clara, her eyes fixed on the doctor's file, felt a strange sense of clarity amidst the chaos. This wasn't just a family secret. It was a social chasm, a stark reflection of a privilege built on deception. She thought of the faded photograph, the kind eyes, the calloused hands, a life lived far removed from their world of opulence, and the undeniable resemblance to Julian, a living testament to a past they tried so hard to erase. "His descendants," Clara said, her voice steady, a quiet strength that surprised even herself. "Where are they now?" The fight had begun. Not just a family reckoning, but a confrontation with a past that reached far beyond the dusty confines of their attic, a past that demanded justice. The truth, long buried, was now a seed, planted deep, ready to bloom. The fight, she knew, was far from over. The scent of old paper and dust clung to Clara as she traced the faded sepia tones of a photograph. A young woman with kind eyes and calloused hands smiling tentatively at the camera. This woman, Elias Thorne's daughter, represented a life worlds away from the Beaumont's gilded cage. The weight of this revelation pressed down on her, a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. "She's remarkable," Clara murmured, her voice barely audible above the ticking grandfather clock in the hall. Julian, his face etched with a mixture of guilt and fascination, approached cautiously. "Remarkable is one word for it," he agreed, his voice rough. "She looks familiar." Eleanor, however, remained rigidly distant, her back ramrod straight as she stared out the ornately carved window, the sprawling estate a testament to a legacy built on lies. The sunlight, usually a comforting warmth, seemed to amplify her isolation, highlighting the deep lines of worry etched around her eyes. The silence hung heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock, each tick a hammer blow against Eleanor's carefully constructed world. Clara's gaze shifted from the photograph to her grandmother. Empathy, a feeling she hadn't expected, stirred within her. The woman, usually so composed, seemed brittle, fragile. "Grandmother," Clara began, her voice softer now, laced with a tentative understanding. This doesn't have to destroy us." Eleanor flinched, turning slowly, her eyes red-rimmed, betraying the silent tears she'd fought so hard to hold back. The mask of composure finally cracked, revealing the vulnerable woman beneath. "Destroy," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. "It already has." She ran a trembling hand through her perfectly coiffed hair, dislodging a stray strand. I built this life on a lie. A terrible, unforgivable lie." Julian stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on his mother's shoulder, a gesture both tentative and heartfelt. The ambition that had once defined him felt insignificant now, dwarfed by the weight of family secrets and long-buried truths. He saw his mother's pain, not as a weakness, but as a testament to the human cost of her carefully constructed deception. This was more than just a family scandal. It was a reckoning with a past that clawed at their very identities. The fight had just begun, but now it was a fight for understanding, for forgiveness, for a future where their past didn't define them. The dusty attic, once a repository of hidden secrets, now felt like a starting point, a place where the first fragile steps toward healing could begin. The heavy oak door to the library creaked shut, muffling the sounds of the storm raging outside. Inside, the air hung thick with unspoken accusations. Eleanor, her face pale and drawn, sat rigidly in her favorite armchair, the intricate tapestry cold beneath her hands. The scent of old leather and polished wood did little to soothe her frayed nerves. Julian paced restlessly, his usual confident stride replaced by a nervous gait. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the worry etched deep into his features. The DNA results, delivered that morning, had shattered their meticulously crafted world. A half-sibling, a secret child from a past Eleanor had vehemently denied, now cast a long shadow over everything they knew. Clara, however, sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the flickering fireplace. The flames mirrored the turmoil within her. While Julian wrestled with the implications for his ambition, and Eleanor grappled with the weight of her deception, Clara felt a strange sense of relief. The truth, however harsh, was a weight lifted. "This changes everything." Julian finally broke the silence, his voice strained. His eyes, usually bright with ambition, were clouded with uncertainty. "My future, my position." Eleanor flinched at his words. The fear that the scandal would taint the Beaumont name, a fear she had always held close, now threatened to consume her entirely. "There must be some mistake," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "There has to be." Clara, however, was already thinking beyond the immediate crisis. She thought of the photograph, the woman with kind eyes and calloused hands, the life lived so far removed from their privileged existence. A life of hardship, yet one that seemed to radiate an inner strength. "No, grandmother," Clara replied, her voice low but steady. "There's no mistake. There's just a truth we've ignored for too long." She met her grandmother's gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and steel. "We need to find this family. We need to understand." The silence that followed was not the suffocating silence of accusation, but a quiet contemplation, a recognition of the long road ahead. The storm outside raged on, mirroring the tempest brewing within their hearts. But amidst the chaos, a fragile seed of hope took root. The fight for understanding had begun. The faded sepia photograph lay on the antique mahogany table, its cracked surface reflecting the flickering gaslight. It depicted a young woman, her face etched with a weariness that belied her youth, cradling a baby. Beside her stood a man, his features obscured by shadow, yet a tenderness lingered in his posture. This was the ancestor they had uncovered, the missing piece of their family puzzle. "She's beautiful," Clara breathed, her voice hushed, a stark contrast to the storm raging outside. The wind howled, rattling the ancient window panes, mirroring the tempest in their hearts. Julian ran a hand over his stubbled jaw, his usual self-assurance replaced by a gnawing unease. "And she's poor, immeasurably so." The revelation struck him harder than he'd anticipated. His meticulously planned future, the carefully constructed edifice of his ambition, felt suddenly precarious. Eleanor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, remained silent, her face a mask of controlled grief. The weight of her carefully guarded secret pressed down on her, suffocating her. The scent of lilies, usually a comfort, now felt cloying, a cruel reminder of her past deception. Martha, the housekeeper, a woman whose age was as shrouded in mystery as the family's past, entered the room. Her eyes, usually twinkling with a knowing amusement, were shadowed with empathy. The years of silent observation had given her a profound understanding of the Beaumont family's complexities. "There's more," Martha said, her voice raspy, yet surprisingly firm. "I found a letter. It speaks of circumstances that led to the child's separation from the family." She placed a worn envelope on the table, its paper brittle with age. The letter, written in a spidery hand, unfolded a tale of societal pressures, of choices made under duress, of a love betrayed. It spoke of a choice that was not made out of malice or callousness, but of a desperate attempt to preserve what little remained. Silence descended again, broken only by the relentless drumming of rain against the windows. The weight of the revelation settled heavily upon them. It wasn't just a hidden relative. It was a hidden history, a testament to a social order that cruelly divided families and lives. This was no longer about a family scandal, but about a legacy built on silence and inequality. The storm outside raged on. Inside, a more profound storm had only just begun. The seed of understanding, planted by Clara's acceptance, was fragile, but it was there fighting for life in the fertile ground of revealed truth. The library, usually a sanctuary of quiet elegance, felt suffocating. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of moonlight slicing through the tall windows, illuminating the aged leather of the armchairs and the spines of countless unread books. Eleanor, her face etched with a weariness that mirrored the ancient tapestries on the walls, sat rigidly, clutching a chipped teacup. Julian paced, his restless energy a stark contrast to his mother's stillness. "It's unbelievable," Julian muttered, his voice barely a whisper above the tick-tock of the grandfather clock. The results of the DNA test, confirming the existence of a half-sibling from a previous generation, hung heavy in the air, a palpable weight that pressed down on them all. Clara, however, sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames in the hearth. A strange calmness settled upon her, a stark contrast to the turmoil that raged within her grandparents. She'd expected anger, denial, even perhaps a touch of shame, but this quiet despair was almost more unsettling. Martha entered, her footsteps barely audible on the thick carpet. She carried a small, worn wooden box, its surface smooth from years of handling. Inside, nestled amongst faded velvet, were more photographs this time. Not posed portraits, but candid shots, capturing moments of unguarded intimacy. A young woman, strikingly similar to Clara, laughed freely, her face lit with a joy that was foreign to the Beaumonts' carefully constructed image. "These were hidden within the attic's false wall," Martha said, her voice low, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "They belonged to her mother." A photograph showed the young woman with a young man, their faces radiant, their hands clasped together. He was not a Beaumont. This was the love, the life, that had been carefully erased from their family history. The image resonated deeply, a tangible record of a happiness denied, a life stolen by social constraints. This changes everything," Julian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The meticulously constructed world he'd known was crumbling, revealing a foundation built on lies and omissions. He looked at Clara, a flicker of something akin to admiration in his eyes. Her quiet strength, her acceptance in the face of such shocking revelations, was a profound contrast to his own turmoil. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice trembling. "It explains so much." The carefully constructed facade had finally cracked, revealing the years of guilt and regret that lay beneath. The weight of her deception, she realized, had been far heavier than any scandal. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on their faces, each one now bearing the weight of a newly discovered past. The storm had only just begun to rage. The accusations flew like shards of glass, each word a precise cut aimed at the heart of the Beaumont legacy. The library, still thick with the scent of old paper and dust, became a battleground. Eleanor, her face ashen, flinched at Julian's sharp tone. "You knew," he accused, his voice raw with a mix of anger and betrayal. "All these years, and you let us live a lie?" His gaze flickered towards Clara, a silent apology in his eyes. Clara, however, remained strangely calm, her expression a mask of controlled fury. The weight of generations of deceit pressed down on her, yet she held herself with a surprising strength. "It wasn't a lie, Julian," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking. The tremor in her hands betrayed the carefully constructed composure she desperately sought to maintain. "It was protection. For all of us." But her words felt hollow, a feeble attempt to justify a lifetime of carefully curated falsehoods. Martha, her usual quiet demeanor replaced with a fierce determination, stepped forward. The firelight glinted off the silver band on her finger, a subtle but significant detail Eleanor had never noticed before. "Protection." Martha's voice, usually a soft murmur, resonated with a steely strength. "From what?" "From the truth." The unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air, a silent indictment of Eleanor's actions. Clara's gaze shifted from her grandmother to Martha, then back again. A flicker of understanding, of shared pain, passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of a bond forged in the crucible of a hidden truth. The weight of the past, of silenced voices and forgotten lives, seemed to settle upon them all, a tangible presence in the opulent room. The meticulously crafted facade of the Beaumont family was shattering, piece by painful piece, revealing the raw, complex emotions underneath. The elegant library, with its silent witnesses of history, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb of carefully preserved secrets. The silence following Martha's words hung heavy, thick as the dust motes dancing in the library's firelight. Eleanor's carefully constructed composure crumbled. Tears, hot and silent, traced paths down her wrinkled cheeks. The scent of lavender from her perfume, usually so sharp and elegant, now seemed fragile, almost pathetic. Julian watched, his anger slowly giving way to a profound sadness. He saw not just his ambitious mother, but a frail, defeated woman confronting a lifetime of lies. Clara, however, remained unmoved. Her gaze, sharp and unwavering, remained fixed on Eleanor. "Protection?" she echoed, the word dripping with icy disdain. "What about the protection of the truth? Of our right to know who we really are?" Her voice, though controlled, held the tremor of years of suppressed rage. The years she had spent wondering why she felt so out of place within the gilded cage of her family's wealth finally crystallized. The fire crackled, spitting embers that mirrored the sparks of conflict igniting in the room. Martha, her gaze steady and compassionate, reached out and gently touched Eleanor's arm. The gesture, small yet powerful, spoke volumes about the unspoken bond between them, a bond born of shared secrets and a quiet understanding. "It wasn't malice, my dear," Martha whispered, her voice a soothing balm against the storm raging in the room. "It was fear. Fear of what the world would think, of what they might do." Her eyes, ancient and wise, met Clara's. "But the truth, child, always finds its way to the surface." Julian, torn between loyalty and the brutal reality unfolding before him, moved closer. He felt a kinship with Clara's anger, a shared frustration that echoed his own conflicted feelings. He knelt beside Eleanor, his touch gentle yet firm. "Mother," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "we need to understand. We need to know the whole truth." The weight of unspoken words, of hidden histories, pressed down on them, a suffocating blanket of guilt and regret. The ornate library, usually a symbol of Beaumont family pride, now felt like a prison, its opulent trappings a cruel mockery of the fractured family huddled within its walls. The night was far from over. The unraveling had only just begun. The truth, like a relentless tide, was beginning to wash away the carefully constructed facade, revealing the raw, complex, and undeniably human reality beneath. The decision felt monumental, etched in the heavy silence that followed Julian's plea. The scent of old paper and dust clung to the air, a tangible representation of the Beaumonts' hidden past. Eleanor, her face etched with a weariness that belied her years of carefully cultivated composure, finally nodded. A single tear escaped, tracing a glistening path through the layers of expensive foundation. "Very well," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fireplace. "The tests, they will be done." The following weeks were a blur of anxious anticipation. Clara, usually vibrant and quick-witted, became withdrawn, her usual rebellious spirit tempered by a quiet intensity. Julian, torn between loyalty and the burgeoning desire for truth, found himself pacing the grand halls of the Beaumont mansion, the polished floors reflecting his inner turmoil. Even Martha, usually stoic and reserved, seemed burdened by an unspoken weight, her normally steady hands trembling slightly as she prepared Eleanor's tea. The results arrived on a bleak November afternoon, delivered by a solemn-faced doctor whose words hung in the air like a death knell. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the frantic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, each tick a hammer blow against their carefully constructed reality. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. A half-sibling, conceived decades ago. A secret child born outside the hallowed halls of Beaumont privilege. The revelation ripped through the family like a wildfire, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. Eleanor's carefully maintained composure shattered. She collapsed onto a velvet chaise lounge, her elegant frame shaking with sobs, a symphony of grief and regret. Julian, his face pale with shock, stared at the report, the words blurring before his eyes. Clara, however, remained strangely calm, her eyes reflecting a chilling mixture of anger and understanding. The years of feeling like an outsider, of sensing a disconnect within her family's carefully curated narrative, finally made sense. The anger she felt wasn't directed at the unknown half-sibling, but at the deception, the years of carefully constructed lies that had fractured her sense of self. The truth, harsh and unforgiving, had finally surfaced, and its consequences were far-reaching and deeply painful. The once impregnable walls of Beaumont pride had begun to crumble, brick by agonizing brick. The accusations flew like shards of glass in the opulent drawing room. Sunlight, filtering through stained glass windows, cast fractured rainbows across the polished mahogany furniture, ironically highlighting the fractured state of the Beaumont family. Eleanor, her face a mask of brittle composure, sat rigidly upright, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles bone-white. "It's not my fault," she whispered, her voice tight with suppressed fury. "It was a mistake, a youthful indiscretion." Clara, however, refused to accept such a simplistic explanation. "A mistake?" she retorted, her voice ringing with controlled rage. "A mistake that shaped a life, a whole family's life, that you chose to bury under layers of wealth and privilege. You stole a part of someone's existence, their very heritage." Julian, caught between his mother's desperate plea for understanding and his sister's righteous anger, paced restlessly. The weight of the revelation pressed heavily on him, the polished floorboards cold beneath his bare feet. He could feel the tremor in his hands, the bitter taste of betrayal clinging to his tongue. "We need to find this person," he said, his voice strained. To understand, to make amends. Martha, her presence a silent but powerful force in the room, spoke for the first time. Her voice, usually hushed and deferential, carried a newfound strength. I know where to start, she said, her eyes, usually downcast, now meeting Eleanor's with unflinching intensity. There are records hidden, tucked away, but it won't be easy. The air hung heavy with unspoken secrets, the scent of lilies from the nearby vase battling with the musty odor of old regrets. The weight of the revelation, the looming consequences, pressed down on them, a tangible presence in the gilded cage of their privileged lives. The gilded cage, it seemed, had finally sprung its fatal trap. Eleanor retreated to her sunroom, the opulent space feeling like a prison. The scent of lilies, usually a comfort, now suffocated her. Sunlight, usually a balm, felt like a spotlight exposing her carefully constructed facade. She traced the delicate veins of a hand-painted rose on the windowpane, its vibrant beauty a stark contrast to the withered feeling inside her. Julian found her there, a glass of amber liquid untouched on the table beside her. He sat beside her, the silence heavy with unspoken words. Mother, he began softly, his voice a low rumble. Martha mentioned records. We have to find this other family. The word family felt alien on his tongue. Eleanor flinched. It was a mistake, Julian. Terrible mistake, but it was long ago. Let it stay buried. Her voice cracked, betraying the carefully maintained composure. The fragility she tried to hide was evident in the tremor of her hand. Julian reached out, covering her hand with his. We can't bury it, Mother. Clara, she's right. We owe them something. We owe them the truth. He felt the tremor in her hand, a shared anxiety binding them despite their differences. Clara, meanwhile, paced the length of the hall, the rhythmic tap of her heels against the polished floor a counterpoint to the unsettling quiet in the sunroom. Anger simmered beneath her skin, a molten rage threatening to erupt. The discovery hadn't just shaken her family. It had shattered her understanding of the world, of her own identity. She stared at a faded portrait of a smiling woman, the resemblance to herself unervingly strong. The past felt like a suffocating weight, a truth she was determined to unearth, regardless of the cost. The weight of the revelation, the injustice of it all, threatened to consume her. The silence in the hall stretched, thick with anticipation and unspoken grief, the weight of generations of secrets pressing down like a physical burden. The air hung heavy with the scent of old wood and dust, a tangible reminder of the hidden history waiting to be revealed. The past, it seemed, was refusing to stay buried. The heavy oak door to Eleanor's sunroom creaked shut, isolating her further in her self-imposed exile. The scent of lilies, cloying and sweet, did little to soothe the bitterness churning within her. She stared at her reflection in the polished mahogany table, a stranger staring back, eyes shadowed, lips tight. The vibrant colors of the hand-painted roses on the window seemed mocking in their vitality. Julian, hesitant but resolute, entered. He carried a worn leather-bound book, its pages filled with faded photographs and yellowed newsprint clippings. Mother, he began, his voice low and measured. I found Martha's records. It confirms everything. Eleanor didn't meet his gaze. It's a mistake, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling of the lilies. A terrible mistake. Let it rest. The tremor in her voice betrayed the carefully constructed composure. It can't rest, Mother, Julian insisted, placing the book gently on the table. Clara, she's right. We need to understand. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, a fear mirroring his own. The weight of inherited secrets, of a carefully concealed past, pressed heavily on them both. A sudden, sharp sound, Clara's voice, cut through the suffocating silence. It's not just a mistake, grandmother. It's a lie built on privilege and deceit. Her voice echoed from the hallway, sharp and accusatory. The anger in her tone was raw, unfiltered. Eleanor flinched, drawing back from Julian's outstretched hand. The fragile peace he'd hoped for shattered, replaced by a rising tide of resentment and unspoken accusations. The sunroom, once a sanctuary, now felt like the epicenter of a brewing storm, the silence thick with the weight of generations of lies. The lilies, once a symbol of comfort, now felt like suffocating witnesses to the unraveling of a family's carefully constructed reality. The truth, long buried, was finally emerging, and it threatened to consume them all. The scent of dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun hung heavy in the air. Eleanor, perched on the edge of her antique chaise lounge, stared blankly at the ornate ceiling, the intricate plasterwork blurring through her unshed tears. The weight of decades, of carefully constructed lies, pressed down on her, suffocating. Julian watched her, a mixture of pity and frustration etched onto his face. Clara, meanwhile, paced the length of the sunroom, her agitation a palpable force. The lilies, once symbols of elegance, now seemed to mock her grandmother's brittle composure. "It's not just about the money, grandmother," Clara said, her voice tight with suppressed fury. "It's about the lie, the deliberate erasure of a whole life." Eleanor flinched, her hand instinctively reaching for the crystal decanter on the side table, her refuge in times of stress. But her hand trembled, and she let it fall back to her lap. "It was a different time," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Things were different." "Different how?" Julian challenged gently, his gaze softening as he saw the genuine pain in his mother's eyes. He understood the burden she carried, the weight of social expectations, the fear of shattering their carefully crafted world. But understanding wasn't the same as forgiveness. Clara rounded on him. "Different in that you hid a whole branch of the family, a life lived in poverty, because it didn't fit your picture of perfection? Because their existence threatened your social standing?" Julian winced. Clara's words, though harsh, were true. The revelation had cracked open a chasm within him, forcing him to confront the hypocrisy of his own life, the privilege he'd taken for granted. He shifted uncomfortably, the embroidered silk of his armchair feeling suddenly constricting. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, filled only with the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hallway, marking the relentless passage of time, a time stained with secrets. The afternoon sun, once warm and comforting, now felt cold and accusing, highlighting the stark lines of Eleanor's grief-stricken face. The weight of their shared past hung heavy in the air, a tapestry woven from privilege, deceit, and the painful awakening of truth. The library, usually a sanctuary of quiet elegance, felt oppressive. Dust motes, illuminated by the late afternoon sun slanting through the tall windows, swirled like tiny, malevolent spirits. Eleanor sat rigid in her leather armchair, the scent of old books and decaying flowers clinging to the air like a shroud. Her hands, usually meticulously manicured, were gnarled and trembling, clutching a chipped porcelain teacup. The fine china, a family heirloom, felt strangely insignificant against the weight of her guilt. "Mother," Julian began, his voice soft but firm, "we need to talk about Martha." He chose his words carefully, aware of the fragile state of his mother's composure. The housekeeper's cryptic warnings, her knowing glances, now held a chilling significance. Eleanor's gaze, sharp and brittle, met his. "Martha. She's always been loyal." The words were strained, a desperate clinging to a familiar narrative. Clara, perched on the window seat, her gaze fixed on the turbulent sky beyond, scoffed softly. "Loyal to whom, grandmother? To the secret you've kept for decades." Her voice, though laced with anger, held a hint of weariness. The fight, it seemed, was exhausting her. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock, each tick a relentless reminder of time's passage, a time filled with secrets and unspoken truths. Julian watched his mother, the lines etched on her face a testament to years of suppressing her true emotions, of maintaining the flawless facade of the Beaumont family. He saw the fear in her eyes, the terror of losing everything she had so carefully built. "She knew," Eleanor finally admitted, her voice barely audible, "about About Thomas. The name, whispered like a forbidden secret, hung in the air. The hidden half-sibling, a shadow from a past Eleanor desperately wanted to erase. The revelation hung between them, a palpable weight, a chasm separating generations. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, transforming the familiar library into a place of somber introspection, a space where the weight of the past threatened to crush them all. The air, once thick with the scent of old paper and leather, now carried the sharp, metallic tang of fear and regret. The chipped paint of the outhouse door felt rough beneath Clara's fingers as she leaned against it, the afternoon sun baking the weathered wood. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves clung to the air, a stark contrast to the manicured lawns of Beaumont Manor. Inside, the cramped space held little comfort, just a cracked porcelain sink and a rusty bucket. But here, away from the suffocating opulence of her family's home, Clara felt a strange sense of peace. Thomas's life, as pieced together from faded photographs and Martha's whispered stories, was a world away from the Beaumonts' gilded cage. She'd seen the pictures. Thomas, a young boy with kind eyes and a dirt-smudged face, working in a bustling city market, his hands calloused from years of labor. A life devoid of privilege, yet brimming with a resilience that Clara found strangely compelling. A sigh escaped her lips. The revelation of Thomas, her great-uncle, hidden away for generations, had shattered the carefully constructed illusion of her family's perfect past. It had also ignited something within her, a fierce empathy for those whose lives were shaped by circumstance, not birthright. He would have liked this. Martha's voice, raspy from years of work and secrets, surprised her. The old woman stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed against the brilliant afternoon light. A basket of freshly picked wildflowers sat beside her. Clara turned, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "What makes you say that, Martha?" Martha's gaze held a depth of understanding that startled Clara. He loved the earth, child. He found beauty in the simplest things. She placed the flowers on a crumbling stone ledge. He wouldn't have understood the Beaumonts' obsession with hiding him. He was part of them, Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. And they threw him away. Not all of them, Martha corrected gently. There was always kindness in the hearts of some. But fear is a powerful thing, child. It can make even the kindest souls do cruel things. Martha's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment, the rigid lines in her face softened. Clara saw a lifetime of unspoken grief reflected in their depths. A weighty silence settled between them, broken only by the chirping of crickets. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the overgrown field. Clara felt a kinship with Martha, a connection forged in the shared knowledge of a painful truth. This quiet, hidden corner of the estate felt less like a place of abandonment and more like a sanctuary of shared secrets and unspoken truths. The weight of the past felt less crushing, a little lighter, as the sun finally set. The grand oak door of Beaumont Manor creaked shut behind Clara, the sound swallowed by the cavernous hallway. Inside, the opulent silence felt oppressive, a stark contrast to the peace she'd found in the overgrown field. The scent of beeswax and old money clung to the air, a suffocating perfume of denial. Eleanor sat rigidly in the library, her back ramrod straight, a fortress built of brittle composure. Sunlight glinted off the diamond brooch at her throat, a symbol of a wealth that couldn't mask the tremor in her hand. "Clara," Eleanor began, her voice thin and reedy, I wanted to apologize." The words hung in the air, fragile as spun glass. Clara met her gaze, the years of carefully constructed distance between them melting away in the face of genuine remorse. It wasn't an easy apology to accept. Years of cold silences and calculated indifference were hard to forgive. "For what, grandmother?" Clara asked, her voice low, cautious. Eleanor's eyes, usually so cold and calculating, were filled with a raw vulnerability. "For everything," she whispered, the admission hanging heavy in the room. "For the lies, for the secrets, for the pain I've caused." She looked down at her hands, twisting the intricate rings on her fingers. "I was afraid," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "Afraid of losing everything." Clara moved closer, the weight of the past pressing down on them both. The ornate furniture, the priceless paintings, the very air in the room seemed to vibrate with the unspoken history. "But you lost something far more valuable," Clara said, her voice soft but firm. "You lost your family." Eleanor's shoulders slumped, the carefully constructed facade crumbling. Tears, silently, traced paths through the expertly applied makeup. This wasn't the strong, unyielding woman Clara had known all her life. This was a woman broken by the weight of her own actions. A shared silence filled the space, broken only by the ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the corner. It was a silence heavy with regret and the hesitant beginnings of understanding. The air, though still thick with the scent of wealth, now carried a faint trace of something new, the possibility of healing. The chipped porcelain teacup warmed Clara's hands, a stark contrast to the icy chill that still lingered in the Beaumont manor. Sunlight, filtered through the dusty leaded panes, cast long shadows across the worn Persian rug. Eleanor, fragile and unexpectedly subdued, stirred her tea, the clinking sound amplified in the heavy silence. "Martha told me things," Clara said, her voice soft, a tremor betraying the carefully constructed composure. The air hung thick with unspoken accusations, with the ghosts of a hidden past. Eleanor looked up, her eyes, usually glittering with control, now clouded with a weariness that touched Clara's heart. Martha. She always had her own agenda. The defense was weak, a flimsy shield against the truth that had shattered their carefully constructed world. Clara didn't press. The weight of generations of secrets pressed down on them both, a shared burden heavier than any inherited fortune. Outside, the wind whispered secrets through the ancient oak trees, a mournful counterpoint to the brittle quiet within. Clara remembered Martha's words, the hushed tones and haunted eyes. The Beaumonts built their empire on a foundation of lies, Miss Clara, and the truth, when it comes to light, can burn brighter than any sun. The image of the faded photograph, a young woman with eyes as bright and defiant as Clara's own, standing beside a man whose rugged hands spoke of honest labor, flickered in Clara's mind. This wasn't just about family secrets. It was about social injustice, about a legacy built on the suppression of another's life. The realization settled heavily in her stomach, a cold knot of anger and understanding. "It wasn't just a secret, grandmother," Clara said, her voice gaining strength. "It was a deliberate erasure." She saw a flicker of something, shame, regret, in Eleanor's eyes. The diamond brooch at her throat, once a symbol of power, now seemed like a heavy weight, a burden of guilt. Eleanor sighed, a long, shuddering breath that spoke of years of pent-up emotion. "I was young, foolish," she whispered, her voice raspy. "I believed I was protecting you all, protecting our name. But I was wrong, terribly wrong." The words, though filled with remorse, couldn't erase the decades of hurt. The afternoon light faded, casting long, ethereal shadows that danced across the room. The silence that followed wasn't the oppressive silence of before, but a heavy, contemplative hush, a space where the possibility of healing took root, amidst the wreckage of shattered illusions and buried truths. The old house seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what the dawn would bring. The scent of beeswax and old money still lingered, but now it was interwoven with the fragile fragrance of a possible reconciliation. The dusty attic air hung heavy with the scent of mothballs and forgotten dreams. Sunlight, fractured by the grime on the attic window, illuminated a single trunk, its brass clasps tarnished with age. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed lace and brittle letters, lay a worn leather-bound journal. Clara, ever the rebel, traced its cracked spine, her fingers brushing against the faded gilt lettering. It belonged to Martha's grandmother, a woman whose name echoed through the hushed corridors of Beaumont Manor, Alara. Julian, ever the pragmatist, watched from the doorway. The weight of the family's unraveling pressed heavily upon him, a counterpoint to the restless ambition that usually fueled him. "It's probably just old family recipes," he muttered, the words lacking conviction, even to his own ears. Clara didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the journal. She felt a strange kinship with this unknown ancestor, a woman who had lived a life so vastly different from her own, yet whose spirit seemed to resonate through the brittle pages. Opening the journal with a delicate crackle, she saw Alara's spidery handwriting, a testament to a life lived with quiet determination. The entries chronicled Alara's life as a laundress in the town, her days filled with backbreaking labor, yet her words vibrated with an inner strength, an unwavering spirit that defied the hardship. She wrote of her love for a man who bore a striking resemblance to Julian, a man whose lineage Clara now understood, connected directly to the Beaumonts. A half-brother to Eleanor's father, a secret carefully guarded and ruthlessly erased from the family narrative. "She mentions a child," Clara whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The implications resonated through the dusty silence. Not just a half-brother, but a nephew, a cousin, a branch of the family tree brutally severed and hidden. The carefully curated image of Beaumont wealth, the facade of privilege, crumbled further with each carefully penned word. Julian, his face pale, moved closer. He saw the same resemblance in the sketches Alara had drawn, the same strength in the woman's words that now echoed in his own conflicted soul. The ambition that once burned so brightly within him dimmed, replaced by a dawning understanding of his family's profound moral failure. The weight of their legacy, a legacy built on lies and deliberate erasure, settled heavily on his shoulders. The sunlight shifted, casting a long, mournful shadow across the room, as if the house itself mourned the hidden truths it had concealed for generations. The silence, broken only by Clara's ragged breathing, held the unspoken weight of generations of deceit. The past, it seemed, was not merely something to be buried, but something that would forever shape their future. The news broke like a dam bursting. Headlines screamed of the Beaumont family's scandalous secret, splashed across every tabloid and respectable newspaper alike. The once pristine image, carefully cultivated over generations, lay shattered in a million pieces. Sunlight, harsh and unforgiving, illuminated the dust motes dancing in the Beaumont Manor's opulent drawing room, mirroring the chaos within. Eleanor, her face a mask of brittle composure, sat rigidly on a velvet chaise lounge, the scent of expensive perfume doing little to mask the tremor in her hands. The ringing of the telephone, a constant, jarring intrusion, seemed to mock her carefully constructed world. Each call, each probing question, chipped away at the facade she'd spent a lifetime building. Julian, his face etched with exhaustion and a profound sense of betrayal, paced restlessly. His ambition, once a consuming fire, felt ashen and cold. The weight of the family's legacy, a burden he'd never fully understood, now pressed down with crushing force. He caught Clara's eye. Her gaze, though sharp with anger, held a flicker of something else, a fierce determination that mirrored his own dawning understanding. "They're demanding a statement," Julian said, his voice tight with suppressed fury. "They want answers." Clara, perched on the edge of an antique chair, her usual rebellious defiance tempered by a weary sadness, simply nodded. The ornate carvings of the chair seemed to mock the family's hollow pretensions. The sheer weight of the revelation, a lineage intentionally erased, a half-brother denied, a family history built on lies, lay heavy upon all of them. Eleanor's voice, when she finally spoke, was a fragile whisper. This changes everything." The statement, though simple, held the weight of a lifetime of carefully constructed deceptions. The opulent room, once a symbol of their power, now felt like a gilded cage. The very air crackled with unspoken accusations, with the ghosts of past actions echoing in the silence. Martha, her face etched with a quiet sorrow, stood silently by the window. Her silence, more eloquent than any words, spoke volumes of the secrets she had kept, the burdens she had borne for so long. The past, it seemed, refused to remain buried. The dust of generations had been stirred, and its revelations threatened to engulf them all. The future, once so certain, was now shrouded in uncertainty, a testament to the enduring power of truth, however painful its unveiling. The mahogany table in the Beaumont Library groaned under the weight of legal documents. The scent of old paper and leather, usually comforting, now felt suffocating. Eleanor, her usually impeccable posture slumped, stared at a photograph, a young woman with laughing eyes, strikingly similar to Clara. The resemblance wasn't just physical. It was in the defiant tilt of the chin, the spark of rebellion in their gaze. She was vibrant, Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking grandfather clock. The words felt foreign even to her. Years of carefully constructed denial crumbled like dry leaves underfoot. Julian, observing his mother's fragility, felt a wave of unexpected empathy. His ambition, once blinding, now seemed a cruel joke in the face of this unearthed truth. He'd always admired his mother's strength, her unwavering control. Now, seeing her vulnerability, he felt a pang of guilt, a recognition of his own complicity in her carefully built facade. Clara, however, felt no such empathy. Anger burned in her chest, a hot coal that threatened to consume her. Vibrant? She was erased, forgotten, like she never even existed. Her voice, sharp and accusatory, sliced through the tense silence. The opulent surroundings felt like a cage, mocking the injustice she felt so keenly. Martha, entering silently, placed a cup of tea on the table, her movements betraying a lifetime spent navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the Beaumont household. Her eyes, dark and knowing, met Clara's. A shared understanding flickered between them, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken truth. The weight of secrets, past and present, pressed heavily on them all. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden light, each particle a tiny testament to the passage of time and the secrets it held. The silence, heavy with unspoken words and years of deceit, hung heavy in the air. The fight for reconciliation was far from over. The battle for truth had only just begun. The scandal exploded. Headlines screamed betrayal, deception, and hidden inheritances. The once immaculate Beaumont image was smeared across every tabloid and news channel. The stately mansion, usually a symbol of quiet, opulent power, was now besieged by flashing cameras and relentless reporters. Inside, the air crackled with tension, a stark contrast to the usual hushed elegance. Eleanor, her face etched with exhaustion and a newfound vulnerability, retreated further into herself. Julian, caught in the maelstrom, struggled to navigate the conflicting pressures of his ambition and his burgeoning guilt. The weight of his mother's carefully crafted lies, a burden he'd unknowingly carried for so long, felt crushing. He watched, helpless, as his carefully constructed future crumbled around him. Clara, however, found a strange sense of empowerment amidst the chaos. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface now burned fiercely, a defiant flame against the injustice she'd witnessed. She saw her grandmother's pain, but felt no empathy, only a righteous fury. "It's not just about us, Julian," she said, her voice sharp against the background hum of the television. "It's about her, about all the others who were silenced, erased." She gestured to a grainy photograph on the table, the young woman with laughing eyes. "This wasn't just a family secret, it was a systemic injustice," she continued, her eyes blazing. "Generations of privilege built on lies. And I won't let them get away with it." Martha, her face etched with a lifetime of unspoken grievances, watched the three of them, a quiet observer in the storm. The media frenzy brought a strange sense of vindication, a quiet satisfaction that the truth, however painful, had finally surfaced. She saw a flicker of understanding in Clara's eyes, a shared recognition of the fight ahead. That night, Julian found himself drawn to the attic, the very space that had unleashed this maelstrom. Dust motes danced in the moonlight filtering through the grimy windows, illuminating the forgotten treasures and forgotten lives. He found a small, worn diary tucked away in a forgotten trunk, its pages filled with the elegant script of his grandmother's ancestor. A story of love, loss, and the unforgiving weight of societal expectations. The words painted a picture far more nuanced than the headlines suggested, revealing a woman of fierce independence, fighting for her place in a world that sought to confine her. The weight of his family's actions pressed down on him, a heavy cloak of inherited guilt. The fight for reconciliation was far from over, but for Julian, a new understanding was beginning to dawn. The fight for truth and for justice had only just begun. The relentless glare of television screens illuminated the faces of the Beaumont family, their usually pristine features now marred by exhaustion and the raw weight of public scrutiny. The opulent drawing room, usually a stage for elegant gatherings, felt suffocating, the silence punctuated only by the insistent drone of news reports. Eleanor sat rigidly, her back ramrod straight, a fragile mask of composure barely hiding the tremor in her hands. The scent of lilies, usually a calming presence, now felt cloying, a stark contrast to the bitter taste of betrayal lingering in the air. Julian paced restlessly, his tailored suit suddenly looking ill-fitting, mirroring the unease churning within. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the weight of the scandal pressing down on him like a physical burden. His ambition, once a driving force, felt like a poisoned chalice. He glanced at Clara, her anger a palpable force in the room, a stark contrast to his own gnawing self-doubt. "They're twisting it," Julian muttered, his voice tight with frustration. "Making it all about money and scandal. They don't understand." Clara didn't look up from the newspaper she held, her grip so tight the paper crinkled. "Understand what, Julian? That generations of your family built their wealth on lies and the systematic erasure of another human being? That they stole her identity, her legacy, her very life?" Her voice, though low, carried an icy edge that cut through the room's suffocating silence. The faint scent of lavender, Martha's usual perfume, drifted from the hallway, a subtle but significant presence amidst the chaos. She appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable, her eyes holding a depth of knowledge that seemed to encompass generations of unspoken truths. Her presence, a silent acknowledgement of the shared history, both heavy and sorrowful, hung in the air. The weight of the past, the stark contrast between the Beaumont's gilded cage and the hidden life it concealed, was a palpable thing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, laden with unspoken accusations and the unspoken weight of years of deceit. The battle for reconciliation felt far away, a distant shore in a stormy sea. The heavy oak door to Eleanor's private study creaked shut, muffling the low hum of the television downstairs. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sun, slanting through the tall windows, illuminating the intricate carvings on her antique writing desk. Eleanor sat hunched over, a single shaft of light catching the silver streaks in her hair. The scent of aged paper and potpourri hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the bitter scent of betrayal clinging to her like a shroud. She picked up a framed photograph, a younger her, laughing arm in arm with a man whose face was deliberately smudged, a testament to the lengths she'd gone to erase him from her life. The guilt was a physical weight, a knot tightening in her chest. The photograph felt like a betrayal, a ghost of a life she'd tried to bury. A soft knock echoed in the stillness. "Gran," Clara's voice, hesitant, yet laced with a fragile hope. Eleanor swallowed, her throat dry. "Come in, Clara." Clara entered, her usual fiery defiance subdued, replaced by a quiet weariness. She carried a worn, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with faded script. "Martha gave me this. It belonged to your sister." Eleanor's breath hitched. The word sister felt like a physical blow. She hadn't thought about her in decades. The journal represented a past she desperately tried to suppress, a past that now threatened to consume her. Clara sat down opposite her, the journal resting on her lap. She loved him," Clara said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "The man in the photo. She wrote about him, about their life, about the choices she made." The silence stretched, filled only with the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice raspy. "She made a choice," she said, more to herself than to Clara. A choice that cost her everything. And you made choices too, Gran? Clara replied, her voice gaining strength. Choices that cost her even more. Choices that have haunted this family for generations. Clara opened the journal, turning the brittle pages. The scent of old paper and fading ink filled the room. A poignant reminder of a lost life. A life now slowly being unearthed. The weight of their shared history, the hidden truths, the buried secrets, all hung heavy in the air. A palpable barrier between them, yet also a fragile bridge, a tenuous connection spanning decades of silence and deceit. The room, once a sanctuary of solitude, now held the potential for either healing or further heartbreak. The courtroom hummed, a low thrum of hushed whispers and rustling papers. Sunlight, filtered through the stained glass windows, cast kaleidoscopic patterns on the polished mahogany. Julian sat rigid, the starched collar of his shirt feeling like a vice around his throat. He watched as Eleanor, her face etched with a weariness that went beyond years, took the stand. The air crackled with anticipation, the weight of generations hanging heavy in the silent space. Clara, perched in the spectator gallery, gripped the worn leather journal Martha had given her. The faded ink, the spidery script, felt like a tangible link to a past she was only beginning to understand. She saw the flicker of defiance in Eleanor's eyes, a familiar spark beneath the layers of regret. It was a look Clara knew well, a reflection of her own rebellious spirit. Mrs. Beaumont, the lawyer's voice cut through the stillness. You are aware of the allegations regarding your family's history? Eleanor's voice, though shaky, held a note of steel. Yes. The single word hung in the air, a testament to her resilience, her refusal to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. The lawyer continued, his questions precise, methodical, each one a carefully placed stone in the edifice of truth being painstakingly constructed. He delved into the details, the hidden letters, the concealed lineage, the deliberate omissions in the family history. Each answer was a small victory for those seeking justice, a slow dismantling of the Beaumont family's meticulously crafted facade. Julian felt a twist of anguish. He saw the pain etched on his mother's face, the silent battle she was fighting, not just against the accusations, but against the ghost of her past. He'd always admired her strength, her iron will, but now he saw its fragility, the cracks in the armor she'd worn for so long. Clara watched, a knot of conflicted emotions tightening in her chest. Anger, pity, and a dawning understanding warred within her. The journal in her lap felt strangely comforting, a tangible link to the woman she'd never met, the woman who'd been denied a place in the family history, a woman who was more akin to her than her own grandmother. The afternoon light shifted, lengthening the shadows across the courtroom. The proceedings continued, a relentless unfolding of truths both painful and liberating. For Eleanor, it was a reckoning. For Julian, a painful but necessary confrontation. And for Clara, the slow but steady piecing together of a fragmented history, a history that bound them together in a way that wealth and privilege could never erase. The seeds of reconciliation, fragile as they were, had been sown. The hard work of forgiveness, however, lay ahead. The mahogany table in Eleanor's study felt cold beneath Clara's fingertips. Dust motes danced in the late afternoon sun, illuminating the intricate carvings. Eleanor, perched stiffly in her armchair, sipped tea, the delicate china rattling slightly in her trembling hand. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations. I didn't know," Eleanor finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking grandfather clock. Her eyes, usually sharp and commanding, were clouded with a profound sadness. Clara didn't reply, her gaze fixed on a faded photograph in the worn leather journal Martha had given her. It depicted a young woman, her eyes mirroring Clara's own rebellious spirit, a woman denied her rightful place in the family history. Julian entered, his face etched with exhaustion. He moved to stand beside Clara, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of silent support. "Mother," he began, his voice low and measured. "We need to talk about Martha." Eleanor flinched. The name hung in the air, heavy with unspoken secrets. Martha, the housekeeper, the keeper of their family's hidden truths, had passed away a week ago, leaving behind a legacy of whispers and revelations. Her death had shaken the family's fragile equilibrium, throwing into sharper relief the painful divisions that had fractured their lives. "Martha, she loved you both," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. She saw something in Clara." A tear traced a path down her lined cheek, a silent acknowledgement of her own culpability. Clara looked up, her heart aching with a mixture of anger and compassion. The rage she'd felt towards her grandmother was slowly giving way to a grudging understanding. The weight of the family's secrets, the decades of lies and omissions, was finally beginning to crumble under the weight of truth. The past, long buried, was exhuming itself, bone by painful bone. "She saw more than you ever did, grandmother," Clara replied, her voice softer now, imbued with a newfound empathy. The room, heavy with years of unspoken feelings, felt charged with the potential for reconciliation, however fragile. The future remained uncertain, but the first steps towards healing had begun. The grand Beaumont estate, usually a picture of polished perfection, felt oppressive. Dust motes, illuminated by the weak winter sun filtering through grimy windows, hung in the air like suspended judgment. Eleanor, cloaked in a severe black dress, sat rigidly at her mahogany desk, the scent of old paper and decaying flowers heavy in the room. Julian paced, his tailored suit creasing with each restless stride, a stark contrast to the stillness of his mother. Clara, however, sat perched on the window seat, the worn leather journal open in her lap. "The press is relentless, mother," Julian said, his voice tight with frustration. Newspaper headlines, detailing the family scandal, were scattered across the desk like fallen leaves. "This isn't just affecting us. It's impacting everything." Eleanor's gaze snapped up, sharp and brittle. "It's a storm we must weather, Julian. A temporary inconvenience." Her voice lacked its usual commanding authority, replaced by a tremor of fear. The carefully constructed facade of the Beaumont family, a legacy built on carefully hidden truths, was crumbling. Clara, however, felt no empathy for her grandmother's plight. She closed the journal, the image of the young woman, her unknown aunt, etched in her memory. The woman's life, so starkly different from her own privileged upbringing, fueled her anger. "Inconvenience? Grandmother, this is about justice, about a life stolen, a history erased." Eleanor flinched, the quiet strength in Clara's voice, a strength forged in the fires of recent revelations, shocked her. Julian moved towards Clara, his hand hovering briefly above hers. The chasm between mother and daughter felt insurmountable. The arrival of their lawyer, Mr. Finch, a man whose polished shoes seemed incongruous with the dust-laden atmosphere, brought a temporary respite from the simmering tension. He spoke of lawsuits, of damage control, of the shifting sands of public opinion. His words were measured, professional, yet they echoed the family's shattered reality. Eleanor listened, her face impassive, yet her hand trembled as she accepted a glass of water, the ice clinking faintly. The cold water mirrored the cold dread settling in her heart. The truth, once hidden, was now a chilling reality. The family's legacy, once untarnished, was stained with the indelible mark of their long-held secrets. The fragile hope for reconciliation seemed further away than ever. The heavy oak door to Eleanor's study creaked shut behind Mr. Finch, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The scent of lilies, usually a comforting presence, now felt cloying, a stark contrast to the dust motes dancing in the weak sunlight. Eleanor, her face etched with a weariness that went beyond the current crisis, finally broke the silence. "He spoke of damage control," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking grandfather clock. Julian, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Damage control? Mother, we've damaged more than just our reputation. We've damaged our family." He looked at Clara, her gaze fixed on the swirling dust motes, a storm mirroring the turmoil within her. Clara didn't respond immediately. The image of her unknown aunt, a young woman working in a bustling city factory, starkly different from the gilded cage of her own life, remained vivid in her mind. The injustice of it all gnawed at her. The anger she felt wasn't just for her aunt. It was for the systemic inequalities that allowed such a blatant disregard for human dignity to exist for so long. A slow, heavy sigh escaped Eleanor's lips. The carefully constructed wall of composure she had maintained for so long showed a crack. Perhaps there is a way to make amends, she murmured, her voice laced with a fragility that surprised even herself. The possibility of reconciliation felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. Julian watched his mother, a flicker of hope igniting in his weary heart. He saw the years of carefully guarded secrets, the weight of her past actions, finally beginning to crack the armor of her composure. The cold, calculating matriarch was dissolving, leaving behind a vulnerable woman who yearned for forgiveness. He crossed the room, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. The gesture was unexpected, a testament to the shifting dynamics within the fractured family unit. Clara, however, remained distant, her silence heavy with unspoken emotions. The path to forgiveness wouldn't be easy. It would require more than just apologies. It demanded systemic change, a complete dismantling of the inherited beliefs that had caused this injustice in the first place. But in her grandmother's faltering voice, in Julian's hesitant touch, she saw a glimmer of hope, a potential for genuine change, a fragile beginning to a long and arduous journey of reconciliation. The dust mote still swirled, but the air, for the first time in days, felt slightly less oppressive. The muted sunlight filtering through the dusty attic window cast long shadows across the discarded furniture. Clara sat on a rickety trunk, the scent of dried lavender and decaying wood filling her nostrils. The weight of the family's secrets pressed down on her, a physical burden mirroring the emotional turmoil within. Julian entered, his footsteps hesitant, his usual confident stride replaced by an almost apologetic gait. He carried 2 steaming mugs. "Cocoa," he offered, his voice low. Martha insisted, said it might help. Clara accepted the mug, the warmth spreading through her chilled fingers. The rich aroma momentarily soothed her frayed nerves. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Julian sat beside her, avoiding her gaze. I'm sorry, Clara," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "For everything. For the lies, for the privilege, for everything." Clara looked at him, truly looked at him, seeing the genuine remorse etched on his face. The anger that had consumed her for days began to ebb, replaced by a hesitant curiosity. "It's not just an apology, Julian," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "It's about what you do now, about what we all do." He nodded, his eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. "I know. I've been thinking. I've made some calls. There are ways we can use our influence, our resources to help." He spoke of a foundation, a project aimed at providing educational opportunities for underprivileged children, a direct response to the injustice revealed by the family's hidden past. It wasn't a complete solution, but it was a start, a tangible demonstration of change. A slow smile played on Clara's lips, a tentative crack in the hardened shell of her anger. The cocoa warmed not just her hands, but her heart. The dust motes danced in the weak sunlight, but the oppressive atmosphere had finally begun to lift. The path ahead remained uncertain, filled with challenges and complexities, but for the first time, the possibility of genuine reconciliation, of healing, felt palpable. The journey was far from over, but they had finally started walking towards it, together. The heavy oak door to Eleanor's study creaked open, revealing a room steeped in the scent of old paper and dust motes dancing in the weak afternoon sun. Eleanor sat at her massive desk, the mahogany gleaming under the light, a stark contrast to the tremor in her hand as she reread the DNA results. The crisp white paper felt like sandpaper against her skin. The truth, undeniable and brutal, stared back at her. Julian entered, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond the usual exhaustion of a long day. He saw the paper, the starkness of its message reflected in his mother's eyes. It's true then?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, the question hanging heavy in the air like the scent of lilies that always clung to the room. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak, the weight of decades of carefully constructed lies crushing her. The silence stretched, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, each tick a hammer blow against her carefully built world. He walked over, the deep pile of the Persian rug muffling his steps. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture both comforting and hesitant. "Mother," he began, his voice thick with unshed tears. I didn't know." "Neither did I, truly," she whispered, her voice cracking. The strength she'd always projected, the iron will that had defined her, crumbled before the simple truth. She looked up at him, her eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, now filled with a raw vulnerability. "But I should have." The unspoken words, "I should have known, I should have cared," hung between them, heavier than any accusation. A tear traced a path down her weathered cheek. The perfect facade, meticulously crafted over years, shattered into a million pieces. The strength she'd always relied on felt fragile, almost non-existent. The weight of her past actions pressed down on her, suffocating her. The scent of lilies, usually comforting, now felt cloying, a symbol of her suffocatingly privileged life, built on a foundation of lies. Julian pulled up a chair, sitting beside her, the silence a shared burden. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves of the ancient oaks, a mournful symphony echoing the turmoil within the study. The weight of the past was a tangible presence, heavy in the air, thick as the dust motes in the sunbeams. The revelation wasn't just a genetic truth. It was a seismic shift in their lives, their identities, their very understanding of themselves and their family. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges, but together, under the weight of shared guilt and the faint glimmer of hope, they began to face the truth. The following days were a blur of hushed conversations and furtive glances. The Beaumont mansion, usually vibrant with activity, felt strangely still, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, a constant reminder of time relentlessly marching forward. Clara, ever the rebel, paced the sun-drenched conservatory, the scent of jasmine failing to soothe her simmering anger. She clutched a chipped porcelain teacup, its delicate floral pattern a stark contrast to the turmoil within her. "It's not fair," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper, the words lost amongst the rustling leaves of the potted palms. "All this privilege, built on a lie." Julian found her there, his own weariness etched deeper than before. He sat beside her, the cool stone of the window seat a comfort against the heat of the day. "I know," he said softly, his voice heavy with a sorrow that mirrored her own. "But it's not just about the lie, Clara. It's about everything that followed. The choices made, the opportunities missed." He trailed off, unable to articulate the complex web of emotions that entangled him. A tentative hand reached out, Clara's fingers brushing against his. The simple touch, a small act of connection, eased the tension between them. It was a shared burden, a shared history they were only now beginning to understand. The weight of their family's secrets, once a hidden burden, now pressed down upon them with the force of a physical presence. The air itself seemed thick with the unspoken words, with the ghosts of the past. "We need to find them," Clara stated, her voice regaining its strength, a flicker of determination in her eyes. "The descendants of our half-sibling. We need to understand their story, their life." Julian nodded, a grim acceptance settling over his features. He was finally ready to confront the reality of their family's history, to acknowledge the injustice that had been perpetuated for generations. The carefully constructed walls of privilege were crumbling, and in their place, a foundation of truth, however painful, was slowly emerging. The path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with challenges, but for the first time, a glimmer of hope fragile yet persistent, pierced through the darkness. The mahogany table in the library felt cold beneath Clara's fingertips. Dust motes danced in the late afternoon sunbeams slanting through the tall windows, illuminating the ornate carvings on the antique furniture. The air hung heavy with the scent of old books and unspoken words. Julian sat opposite her, his usual sharp features softened by a weariness that mirrored her own. He nervously adjusted his cufflinks, the polished silver glinting under the light. "I've been thinking," Julian began, his voice low, "about what Martha said, about the farm, the life they led." He paused, choosing his words carefully. The weight of the revelation pressed heavily on him, the carefully constructed facade of his privileged life cracking under the strain of truth. Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on the swirling dust motes. The silence stretched, filled only with the soft ticking of the grandfather clock, a relentless metronome marking the passage of time. The image of the faded photograph, a young woman with kind eyes and sun-weathered skin, a stark contrast to the polished portraits of her ancestors, burned in Clara's memory. The injustice of it all, the generations of silence and carefully curated lies, fueled her simmering anger. "It's not just about the money, is it?" she said, her voice husky. "It's about everything they were denied, the opportunities, the respect." She looked at Julian, her eyes searching. "We were raised on a lie, Julian, and that lie has consequences." Julian sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "I know, and I feel responsible for the legacy of it all, for what we've inherited." He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room, his restless energy a stark contrast to the stillness of the library. "I can't just stand by and let this injustice continue." He stopped, turning to face Clara, his eyes filled with a newfound resolve. "I'm going to use my influence, my position to try and make things right, to help those who were wronged like them, like our family." A faint smile touched his lips, a glimmer of hope piercing the darkness that had enveloped them. It was a tentative step, but it was a start. The crumbling walls of their family's carefully constructed past were revealing a new foundation, one built on truth, empathy, and perhaps even redemption. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Beaumont Manor. Inside, the air crackled with a nervous energy. Eleanor, usually the picture of composed elegance, sat hunched in her armchair, a fragile porcelain doll amidst the opulent surroundings. Her hands, usually adorned with glittering jewels, were clasped tightly in her lap, their tremor barely concealed. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock, each second a hammer blow against her composure. Clara, observing her grandmother from across the room, felt a pang of unexpected empathy. The woman who had always seemed so unyielding, so impervious to emotion, was visibly crumbling. The weight of their shared history, the unveiled secrets, pressed heavily on them both. "Grandma," Clara began, her voice soft, hesitant. The word felt strange on her tongue, a bridge between the past and this fragile new reality. "What happened with Martha's family? I need to understand." Eleanor looked up, her eyes, usually cold and calculating, now filled with a weariness that went beyond the years. "It was a different time, Clara," she whispered, her voice raspy. "A time when choices were made. Choices that I deeply regret." A single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek, leaving a glistening trail in its wake. Clara approached her grandmother cautiously, the years of carefully constructed distance melting away in the face of shared vulnerability. She knelt beside the armchair, taking Eleanor's frail hand in hers. The coolness of the aged skin was a stark contrast to the warmth of Clara's touch. "I understand, Grandma," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "It doesn't excuse what happened, but I understand." Julian entered the room, his face etched with concern. He carried a worn leather-bound book, the family's genealogy, updated with the shocking new information. The weight of the revelation, the responsibility of their family's past, was visibly evident in his posture. He paused, watching the quiet moment between his mother and daughter, a rare display of vulnerability within their usually rigid family dynamic. The air, thick with unspoken words and shared grief, was heavy with the scent of lilies and regret. A new chapter was unfolding, one written not in wealth and privilege, but in acceptance, truth, and the painful process of reconciliation. The scent of old paper and dust still clung to Julian's fingers as he carefully placed the updated genealogy back on the table. The weight of the past, heavy as the leather-bound book itself, pressed down on him. He watched Eleanor and Clara, their fragile truce hanging in the balance, a precarious piece in the opulent, yet suddenly hollow drawing room. The afternoon sun, slanting through the tall windows, cast long shadows that mimicked the long shadows of their family's secrets. "There's more," Julian said softly, his voice breaking the fragile silence. He cleared his throat, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the room. "Martha." She had a letter. He pulled a crumpled envelope from his pocket, its edges frayed with age. The faded ink hinted at a story untold for generations. Eleanor flinched. Her eyes, though still weary, held a flicker of fear. Clara, however, leaned forward, her expression a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. The years of rebellion seemed to melt away, replaced by a quiet determination to finally understand. Julian unfolded the brittle paper, his movements careful, reverent. He began to read, his voice a low murmur that filled the room. "My dearest Thomas, I write to you on this day, burdened by secrets that eat at my soul. The life I live, it's a gilded cage. The price of silence is high, but the truth will one day set my daughter free." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, silent this time, but no less devastating. The letter, a tangible link to a past she had tried so desperately to bury, was unraveling her carefully constructed facade. Clara, however, felt a surge of understanding. The pain, the regret, it resonated with her own youthful rebellion, a shared inheritance of unspoken truths. "Thomas was her father," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible, the question hanging in the air like a fragile butterfly. Eleanor nodded, a single, almost imperceptible movement. The weight of her silence, the years of deception, seemed to crumble away, leaving behind a raw vulnerability. The gilded cage, the one she'd built so meticulously around herself and her family, had finally sprung open. The sunlight, streaming through the window, seemed to illuminate not just the room but the depths of her soul, laying bare the years of regret and the tentative hope for forgiveness. The ticking of the grandfather clock, once a symbol of her rigid control, now seemed to mark the passing of time, not as a relentless march, but a gentle rhythm of healing. The silence that followed was not the suffocating silence of the past, but a quiet contemplation of the future. A future born of truth and the fragile possibility of reconciliation. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished mahogany table, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. Julian, his face etched with weariness, watched Eleanor. Her usually impeccable composure was shattered. Her hands trembled as she nervously rearranged a crystal vase. The weight of the letter, the revelation of her hidden past, hung heavy in the air, a palpable presence. Clara, surprisingly quiet, observed them both. The anger that had fueled her rebellion was fading, replaced by a complex mix of sadness and understanding. The shared pain, the unspoken truths that bound them, were finally surfacing. "It wasn't easy," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking of the grandfather clock. Her eyes, red-rimmed and glistening with unshed tears, met Julian's. "Keeping it hidden, protecting you both. I thought I was doing what was best." Julian nodded slowly, his heart aching with empathy. He saw the fear, the regret, the desperate need for forgiveness etched onto her face. The powerful matriarch, the woman who controlled their lives with an iron fist, was reduced to a vulnerable, heartbroken woman. "But it wasn't," Clara said, her voice low but firm. It built walls, created lies, separated us. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, with years of suppressed emotions. The opulent drawing room, once a symbol of their privilege and power, felt suddenly small, confining, and heavy with the weight of their shared history. Eleanor reached out, her hand trembling as it brushed against Clara's. The touch, tentative yet genuine, held a lifetime of unspoken apologies, of regret and a desperate plea for understanding. Clara returned the gesture, her hand covering Eleanor's, a silent affirmation of the fragile bond they were beginning to forge. "There's so much to understand," Julian said, his voice soft, "so much to atone for." He looked at both of them, a flicker of hope illuminating his tired eyes. "But we can start now." The heavy air seemed to lighten slightly, the shadows less menacing. The possibility of healing, of reconciliation, shimmered faintly in the afternoon light, a fragile but persistent hope. Eleanor's confession hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The scent of lilies, usually a comforting presence in the drawing room, now felt cloying, a stark contrast to the raw emotion filling the space. Julian, his gaze fixed on his mother's trembling hands, felt a surge of unexpected pity. The ironclad Eleanor, the woman who had always presented an unyielding facade, was crumbling before him. Clara, however, remained strangely still, her usual fiery spirit momentarily subdued. The anger hadn't vanished entirely. It simmered beneath the surface, a potent undercurrent to her quiet observation. She saw the genuine remorse in her grandmother's eyes, a stark contrast to the carefully constructed image she'd known for her entire life. The polished mahogany gleamed under the afternoon sun, reflecting the fragility of the moment. "It wasn't just about protecting us," Julian finally said, his voice low and measured. He understood now the desperate attempt to preserve a carefully crafted image, the fear of shattering their privileged world. It wasn't simply about wealth. It was about identity, about the fear of losing everything they believed themselves to be. He rose and walked to the window, the cool glass a welcome contrast to the emotional heat in the room. Outside, the manicured lawn stretched towards the distant horizon, a symbol of the Beaumont family's carefully constructed reality. He saw the truth now. The meticulously maintained gardens were a mirror of their meticulously maintained lives, a beautiful facade hiding cracks in the foundations. Eleanor followed him, her steps hesitant, her shoulders slumped with the weight of her burden. I wanted to believe it myself, Julian. I wanted to believe in the life I built." Her voice was choked with tears, the carefully cultivated composure finally shattering completely. Clara approached them, her steps deliberate, her expression thoughtful. "The life you built on a lie." Her tone was not accusatory, but deeply sorrowful. She saw the pain in her grandmother's eyes. She understood the sacrifices, the fear, the desperation behind the deception. "I wanted a better life for you both," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely a breath. "A life free from the limitations of our other family." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken history. A silence fell, broken only by the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock, each tick a tiny hammer blow against the fortress of their carefully constructed lives. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows, as if to emphasize the depth of their shared past, the weight of their secrets, and the fragile hope that was beginning to bloom amongst them. The reconciliation wouldn't be easy. It would be a long, arduous journey. But in that moment, in the quiet acknowledgement of shared pain, a tentative beginning emerged. The grandfather clock's chime, a sharp counterpoint to the lingering silence, jolted them from their shared reverie. Dust motes danced in the late afternoon sunbeams, slicing through the tall windows, illuminating the intricate carvings on the antique furniture. Eleanor, her face etched with a weariness that belied her years of rigid control, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. The scent of lilies, now less cloying, mingled with the faint aroma of old books and forgotten things. Clara, unexpectedly, offered her grandmother a small, hesitant smile. "It wasn't just a lie, Grandma," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. It was a life built on a desperate hope for something better for us. Julian, ever the mediator, placed a comforting hand on his mother's shoulder. "We need to understand, Mother. We need to understand them." He gestured towards the faded photographs, scattered across the mahogany table like fallen leaves, visual evidence of a history deliberately buried. Eleanor nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the fine lines etched around her eyes. The weight of her deception, the years of carefully constructed lies, seemed to visibly lessen. "Martha, she knows more than she lets on," she confessed, her voice barely audible. She was connected to them. The mention of Martha, the family's long-serving housekeeper, sparked a fresh wave of questions. The unspoken accusations, the veiled hints, the years of subtle observations suddenly coalesced into a more complete picture. The woman who had witnessed their lives, their secrets, their carefully guarded facade, held a key to the truth. Finding her, understanding her role, became the next crucial step in their journey towards reconciliation. The silence that followed was no longer heavy with unspoken accusations, but with a shared sense of purpose, a collective yearning to finally uncover the complete truth. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room, painting the scene with an ethereal glow, as if blessing their tentative steps towards healing and understanding. The journey would be long and arduous, filled with challenges and obstacles. But in that quiet moment, amidst the dust and shadows of the past, a fragile hope took root, promising a future built on honesty and acceptance. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the attic's dusty window panes, illuminating swirling motes of dust. Eleanor sat heavily in a worn armchair, the scent of lilies, her signature perfume, oddly jarring against the musty air. Clara, surprisingly, sat beside her, a sketchbook resting open on her lap, filled with sketches of the unearthed photographs. "Grandma," Clara began, her voice soft but firm. "Martha's absence. It feels deliberate. She knew about this." Eleanor sighed, the sound like the rustling of dry leaves. "She's always been protective. Of me, of us." Her gaze drifted to the faded pictures, a flicker of fear in her eyes. She saw things, new things. Julian entered, carrying a steaming mug. "Coffee, Mother? Clara?" He offered a small, tired smile, the weight of the previous day's revelations heavy upon him. He placed the mug on a nearby table, the clink a sharp sound in the quiet room. "I've been researching the family history. The timeline doesn't add up. There are gaps, inconsistencies." He paused, his gaze intense. "There's a mention of a charitable organization, obscure and long defunct. One that provided aid to impoverished families in the city slums. A name, a detail that links back to the photographs, to Martha, even to them." The unspoken accusation hung in the air. The weight of the secret, once a carefully constructed wall, was now crumbling brick by brick. Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for her coffee. The steam curled around her face, obscuring her expression for a moment, before a single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. Clara reached out, her hand covering her grandmother's. A silent understanding passed between them. The unspoken words, the shared history of lies and carefully crafted illusions, began to unravel, replaced by a tentative sense of shared burden, of shared responsibility. The journey to reconciliation was far from over, but in the heart of that dusty attic, under the pale morning light, a fragile seed of hope had been planted. The faint scent of old paper, dust, and lilies now mingled with the hopeful aroma of freshly brewed coffee, suggesting a new beginning, however uncertain it may be. The search for Martha, the investigation into the charitable organization, became their shared quest. The past, though painful, now held the promise of healing. The weight of the unspoken hung heavy in the attic air, thick as the dust motes dancing in the morning sunbeams. Eleanor, usually so composed, looked fragile. The lilies sent a stark contrast to the room's mustiness. Her trembling hand reached for the coffee Julian offered, the porcelain cool against her skin. Clara's touch, light but firm on her grandmother's hand, was a lifeline. The silence, punctuated only by the occasional sigh and the gentle clinking of the spoon against the mug, held more truth than any shouted accusation. Julian's words echoed: the charitable organization, the impoverished families, a link to their hidden past. He spoke again, his voice low. The records are fragmented, but there's a recurring name, a woman, Martha's mother. He paused, the unspoken implication hanging in the air. The possibility of a blood connection between Martha and the forgotten branch of the family. A connection Eleanor had so diligently hidden, sent a fresh wave of fear through the matriarch. Eleanor's eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were clouded with a mixture of regret and fear. The carefully constructed facade of her life was crumbling, revealing a foundation of lies and omissions. She whispered, her voice barely audible, She protected them. Clara, watching her grandmother, understood. The protective instinct, the desperate need to shield their privileged world from a harsh reality. But now the protection had become a cage. She gently squeezed Eleanor's hand, a silent promise of support, of understanding. The sunlight, streaming through the dusty window, illuminated the faded photographs scattered on the old trunk. Faces, blurred by time and neglect, stared back, silent witnesses to a carefully hidden truth. The past, once a buried secret, was now threatening to consume them. The journey to reconciliation was paved with uncertainty, but the first tentative step had been taken. The shared burden, the shared responsibility, was a heavy weight, but in its weight, a fragile hope began to bloom in the dusty heart of the Beaumont mansion. The scent of lilies and old paper now shared space with the promise of healing and the bittersweet acknowledgement of a truth long suppressed. The afternoon sun, a hazy orb through the attic's grimy window panes, cast long shadows across the scattered photographs. Dust motes danced in the golden light, a silent ballet accompanying the unspoken anxieties swirling within the room. Eleanor, her usually impeccable posture slumped, stared at a faded image, a young woman with eyes strikingly similar to Clara's, but dressed in worn, simple clothes. The contrast with Eleanor's own elegant attire in a nearby photo was jarring. She was resilient, Eleanor whispered, her voice raspy, the words catching in her throat. The carefully constructed walls of her composure were crumbling, brick by weary brick. Clara, sensing her grandmother's vulnerability, moved closer. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on Eleanor's arm, a gesture both comforting and assertive. Resilient and brave, Clara added softly, her voice filled with a newfound empathy. She saw not just a woman from a different era, but a woman who had endured hardship with an unspoken dignity. Julian, observing them from across the room, felt a shift within himself. The weight of his ambition, once so consuming, felt lighter, almost insignificant compared to the raw emotion filling the attic. He had been consumed by his own plans, blinded by the family's image. But now, witnessing this quiet exchange, he understood. The past couldn't be erased, but it could be acknowledged, understood, and even, perhaps, forgiven. Martha knew her, Eleanor murmured, her gaze drifting towards the dusty window, the sunlight illuminating the faint lines etched around her eyes, lines of worry, regret, and possibly a dawning acceptance. She protected her secret. A long silence followed, filled only with the rustling of old papers and the distant sounds of the mansion settling around them. The silence wasn't heavy with accusation now, but pregnant with shared history, a collective understanding forming between the three of them. The unspoken words hung in the air, a testament to years of lies and omissions, but also a testament to a growing sense of connection, of shared responsibility. The weight of their past remained, a burden they carried together, but within that shared burden, a seed of reconciliation was finally taking root. The dusty attic, once a symbol of hidden secrets, now seemed to hold the promise of a different kind of legacy, one built not on denial and privilege, but on honesty and shared humanity. The scent of old paper and dust clung to them, a tangible reminder of the secrets unearthed. Eleanor, her face etched with a weariness that belied her years of carefully cultivated composure, traced a finger across the faded photograph. The young woman's smile, despite the poverty hinted at in her worn clothes, held a captivating resilience. It mirrored a strength Eleanor had long suppressed within herself. She was strong, Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking grandfather clock echoing from the hallway below. The admission, though small, felt monumental. Clara, her earlier anger tempered by a burgeoning empathy, gently squeezed her grandmother's hand. And she loved, Clara added, her voice soft yet firm. She saw not a threat to the Beaumont legacy, but a kindred spirit, a woman who had endured hardship with quiet dignity. Julian, his ambition momentarily eclipsed by the weight of revelation, watched them. The carefully constructed facade of his family, the legacy he'd been so diligently striving to uphold, felt fragile, almost irrelevant in the face of this newly revealed truth. He'd always felt a pull towards social justice, a dissonance between his privileged upbringing and his inherent compassion. This discovery had shattered the carefully constructed walls around that conflict, leaving him with a profound sense of guilt and a stirring of purpose. A sliver of late afternoon sun pierced the grimy attic window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden light. The scene held a poignant beauty, a fragile balance between sorrow and hope. The weight of their shared history pressed down on them, a heavy blanket of unspoken words and lingering regrets. "Martha," Eleanor began, her gaze drifting towards the dusty window. She knew. She protected her. The housekeeper's loyalty, once a mystery, now held a tragic beauty. Her silent guardianship, her unspoken sacrifices, added another layer to the complex tapestry of their family history. The silence that followed was not one of accusations, but of shared understanding. The past remained, an undeniable part of their identity, but it no longer held the power to define them. A tentative connection, fragile yet potent, had formed between them, a bond forged in the crucible of revelation. In the dusty attic, amidst the shadows of the past, a new dawn was breaking, tinged with both sorrow and the promise of reconciliation. The seeds of forgiveness, planted in the soil of shared pain, were beginning to sprout. The dust motes, illuminated by the weak afternoon sun, swirled like tiny, melancholic spirits. Eleanor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, stared at the worn floorboards. The silence in the attic, thick with the scent of aged wood and forgotten things, pressed down on them. Julian shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his inherited privilege feeling heavier than ever. Clara, however, remained still, her gaze fixed on her grandmother. "It's not just about the money, Grandma," Clara said softly, her voice breaking the oppressive quiet. "It's about her." She gestured towards the faded photograph, the young woman's smile a poignant counterpoint to the austere beauty of the Beaumont mansion. Eleanor's breath hitched. "She was different," she finally whispered, her voice raspy, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Stronger than I ever was." A single tear traced a path through the wrinkles etched around her eyes, a testament to years of suppressed emotion. Julian cleared his throat, his voice strained. "We need to find her descendants," he said, the words a declaration of intent, a step towards mending the fractured legacy. He looked at Clara, a new resolve hardening his features. His ambition, once solely focused on maintaining the Beaumont name, now felt interwoven with a deeper sense of purpose. "I've already started," Clara replied, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "There are records, birth certificates, old newspaper clippings, fragments of a life deliberately hidden, but not entirely erased." The afternoon light faded, casting long shadows across the attic floor. The air grew colder, the silence punctuated only by the distant hum of the house settling, and the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock downstairs, a relentless reminder of time's relentless march. Eleanor reached out, her trembling hand touching Clara's. It was a tentative gesture, a fragile bridge across the chasm of years of unspoken resentments and carefully concealed truths. I want to meet them," Eleanor murmured, her voice barely a breath. The admission, this simple expression of longing, felt monumental. It was the first crack in the wall of denial she had so meticulously constructed. Julian nodded, a profound sense of relief washing over him. "We'll find them, Mother, and then we'll begin to make amends." The weight of their shared history still pressed down, heavy and inescapable. Yet, in the heart of that dusty attic, amidst the shadows of the past, a fragile ember of hope glowed, a promise of reconciliation, a beginning, not an end. The scent of dust and old paper no longer felt like a suffocating shroud, but rather a reminder of the resilient spirit that had survived, a testament to the enduring strength of the human heart. The initial tentative steps toward reconciliation felt fragile, like bridging a chasm on a single swaying rope bridge.